On the 20th of September 1943, General Edward Milford entered the small village of Leh. The once mighty Japanese base and fortress was now little more than ruins. The base area for the 51st Japanese Division had been savaged by the US 5th Air Force, its neat streets now lined with broken buildings and burned cars. The signs of a hasty Japanese retreat were everywhere. Guns, artillery pieces, ammunition, and personal effects littered the streets. Milford's 5th Division had spearheaded the final stage of operations around Salamaua, a grinding battle that had seen some of the most brutal mountain fighting of the entire Pacific War. In the mountains around Mubo, Wau, and Salamaua, General Hidemitsu Nakano's 51st Division, along with an ensemble of supporting Japanese infantry and base units, had been drawn into a grinding 8-month-long fight with the Australian 3rd and then 5th Divisions. Ably supported by the American 41st Division, the Australians had driven the Japanese back from one line of mountaintop defences to the next, constantly drawing Japanese reinforcements into the Salamaua meat grinder and away from the actual Allied objective, Leh. In the largest Allied offensive of the Pacific War to date, Leh was enveloped by an Australian corps, with Nakano pinned between the 5th, 7th and 9th Australian Divisions. In all, during the final assault on Salamaua and Leh, 25 Australian battalions, 3 American battalions and 2 independent companies, with their quota of supporting troops, had been employed. In fact, including the earlier fighting around Wau and Mubo, elements of 5 Allied divisions had been committed to the 1943 New Guinea offensives, making the operation larger in scale than the far more famous Guadalcanal campaign. Although through hasty flight Nakano's 51st Division had escaped complete destruction at Leh, it was forced to leave all of its heavy weapons and equipment behind. Its remnants were now marching through the precipitous Sarawagad Mountains, with elements of the 9th and 7th Australian Divisions hot on their heels. The simple truth is Nakano and the Japanese command generally had been badly outmaneuvered at Leh. It was only the rain-swollen rivers and mountain clouds that had allowed them to escape the Australian pincers. Most of Nakano's men were in truly disastrous shape. The combat in the mountains above Salamaua had been some of the most grueling of the entire Pacific War, and now most of the men had little more than rifles with them. Their objective was Sio, on the north coast of the Huon Peninsula, but to get there would require a nightmarish retreat across truly fearsome terrain, jungle-covered mountains which rise to over 4,000 metres. Operation Postern, the Allied offensive in New Guinea, had been the centrepiece of Allied land operations against Japan in 1943. The Supreme Allied Commander, Southwest Pacific Area, General Douglas MacArthur, had been placed in overall command of all Allied forces in both the South and Southwest Pacific areas. The objective given to him was the isolation of the great Japanese base at Rabaul. Japan's strategic position was centred on 2 major air and naval bases, Truk and Rabaul. From these 2 bastions, Japanese air and naval forces could engage any Allied attempt to launch amphibious operations within the Southern Resource Zone, Japan's primary centre of gravity outside of the home islands themselves. Before any advance on the Philippines could be contemplated, Rabaul had to be neutralised and bypassed. MacArthur had developed a theatre-wide campaign plan for 1943, which focused on Rabaul. Called Operation Cartwheel, this campaign plan envisaged a large-scale pincer attack on Rabaul itself. On the right flank, Admiral Bull Halsey's South Pacific forces would advance up the Solomon Island chain from their newly conquered base at Guadalcanal, with the objective of establishing air bases on the island of Bougainville. This would bring Rabaul and New Britain within medium bomber and fighter range. But the main effort of Operation Cartwheel would be made in New Guinea. The Japanese position in New Guinea was centred on a number of heavily fortified air and naval bases which stretched along the north coast. From these base areas, Japanese air power could contest any large-scale Allied naval operations in the Bismarck Sea, providing reconnaissance for the heavy IJN main fleet units based at Truk. Possession of these bases would not only isolate Rabaul, but was a prerequisite for any offensive towards the Philippines. The Japanese had 3 major concentrations in New Guinea: the twin positions of Salamaua and Leh at the mouth of the Markham River Valley, Madang on the north coast of the Huon Peninsula, and Wewak near the border of the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese positions in New Guinea, in addition to all combat units in the theatre, were commanded by General Hatatsu Adachi. A veteran of the Sino-Japanese War with a reputation as a fighting general, Adachi commanded the 18th Japanese Army. Its main strength was composed of 3 army divisions, the 51st, 41st, and 20th, although this was augmented by various supporting elements such as base units. Supporting these ground forces was General Kumachi Teramoto's 4th Air Army. Although headquartered at Rabaul, by late 1943, Teramoto's main strength, most of the 6th and 7th Air Divisions, were deployed in New Guinea, primarily in the Great Air Base at Wewak. In all, even after the fall of Salamaua and Lae, Japanese forces in New Guinea had an approximate strength of 100,000 personnel. The primary objective of Operation Postturn was not only to facilitate the isolation of Rabaul by acting as the left pincer of Operation Cartwheel, but to allow the Allies to break out into the Bismarck Sea. Because of the overwhelming Allied strength in the air, if air bases could be established on the north coast of New Guinea, then the Allies could effectively leapfrog the major Japanese concentrations and defences. Staying beneath Allied land-based fighter cover, the comparatively weak 7th Fleet could rapidly advance into Dutch New Guinea, the Admiralty Islands and Palau, bringing MacArthur's real objective within reach, the Philippines. But this rapid campaign of exploitation could not be launched until the Allies were able to break through the main Japanese defences in New Guinea. The critical position was the Vitiaz Strait. Separating the Huon Peninsula and the island of New Britain, Japanese domination of this geographical choke point effectively rendered any plans for an offensive towards the Philippines purely academic. This area had to be cleared. Although there were some Japanese forces on the far western tip of New Britain, by far the most formidable defences were on the Huon Peninsula. Here the Japanese had the major base areas of Madang and Lae, which had just fallen, in addition to the port towns of Sio and Finschhafen. Between Madang and Lae, Adachi deployed the bulk of the 18th Army, with the 51st and 20th Divisions in the forward area. The largely fresh 41st remained concentrated in Wewak. Thus, the Huon Peninsula was the lock that barred the door to the Philippines, and the Australian Army was once again tasked with breaking it down. With the deteriorating situation at Salamaua now clear in Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters quickly formed a new campaign plan. On the 2nd of September, Adachi received the following orders from General Hitoshi Imamura's 8th Area Army headquartered at Rabaul. 1. Units in the Lae-Salamaua area will meet the attacking enemy with present local strength and attempt a holding action. In the meantime, defences in the Dampier Strait region will be quickly strengthened. 2. The Army and Navy will use every means available to ensure supply and replacements to the Lae-Salamaua area. To this end, effort shall be made to provide at least an amount equal to August shipments. 3. If the situation makes it absolutely imperative, Army and Navy units in the area will be transferred to the rear at an opportune time. The 18th Army Commander will direct this operation and will endeavour to move his forces to the Finschhafen area. 4. The Army and Navy will station strong units on Umboy Island and on both coasts of the Dampier Strait, insofar as supplies permit, thereby strengthening the defence of the strait and giving all possible protection to surface transportation in the area. Thus, realising the inevitability of defeat at the hands of the 5th Division around Salamaua, Imperial General Headquarters had envisaged redeploying its forces to the Huon Peninsula well before Lae had fallen. But the isolation of Lae by the combined airborne insertion of the 7th Division into the Markham River Valley and the amphibious landing of the 9th to the town's east had clearly come as a shock to Adachi, Imamura, and Tokyo. Prior to the receipt of this new campaign plan, Adachi had been completely focused on the continued defence of Salamaua. He had obviously not expected an Allied offensive of that magnitude to be executed by such a dexterous campaign plan. His forces were in no way perfectly arranged for the defence of the Huon Peninsula. The 51st Division, now more of a polyglot formation composed of numerous regiments and base units, was now running for its life into the pristine wilderness of the Sarawagad Range. Even before the disaster at Lae, this force was capable of little more than static defence. It had been steadily ground down by constant Allied offensives around Salamaua. Indeed, it had suffered badly at the hands of the Australians in intense jungle combat, a form of warfare in which the Australian Army was becoming more and more specialised. The 51st Division was now little more than 9,085 lightly armed refugees. With the loss of Lae, Adachi was now committed to holding his next major base area, Madang. If it fell, then the entire Japanese defensive position around Rabaul would have been compromised. But the primary combat unit he had been relying upon to hold the Allies was now running for its life in the Busu River Valley. At Madang, the bulk of the 20th Division was intact, but Japanese intelligence had identified 2 new Australian divisions that were now in and around Lae, formations that would clearly move on Madang. Adachi's forces were strung out along the north coast of New Guinea. The remnants of the 51st Division, about 9,000 in number, were retreating through the mountains. These forces would require weeks of rest, recuperation, and rearmament before they would be combat ready again. At Madang and the Huon Peninsula, he had around 30,000 men, the main strength of which was the largely fresh 20th Infantry Division. The army's main strength was much farther north around Wewak. This was the largest Japanese base with extensive airfield facilities. Some 35,000 men, including Navy, base and Air Force personnel, were under the command of the 41st Division headquarters. Wewak is some 300 kilometers from Madang, and without large amounts of shipping or aircraft, moving large units from one base area to the other was extremely slow and difficult. Nonetheless, Adachi quickly ordered elements of the 41st Division to move to Madang from Wewak, but like all things in the Papuan and New Guinea campaigns, logistics and the difficulty of the country hindered his movements. Despite these challenges, Adachi immediately began to deploy the 20th Division for battle. The geography of this part of New Guinea, specifically the rugged, mountainous interior of the Huon Peninsula, limited the possible Allied axis of advance to just 2 alternatives. To the south of the Finisterre and Sarawagad ranges runs the wide-open, grassy Markham and Ramu river valleys. These meandering rivers, which flow in opposite directions, the Markham east, Ramu west, have carved out a flat, open highway. About 25 kilometers in breadth at its widest, the joint Markham and Ramu River Valley runs from east to west for about 200 kilometers. Although this was an attractive avenue of approach to Madang, the Ramu Valley is separated from the coastal plain by the precipitous foothills of the Finisterre Range, which would provide Japanese forces with ideal defensive terrain. The other possibility open to the Allies was to use their amphibious forces to move along the north coast of the peninsula. Given the Allied dispositions, with one Australian division poised to move up the Markham and the other along the coast, Adachi began to move his forces forward. In the Ramu Valley, the Japanese had been working on a road connecting Madang and Lae. By late 1943, this had crossed the mountains and had been extended several tens of kilometers up the valley, terminating at the town of Kayapit. Over 20,000 Japanese personnel, primarily the 20th Division less the 80th Regiment, and an ensemble of supporting formations, had been allocated to the construction of this all-important road, upon which Adachi's hopes for the successful defense of Lae and Salamaua rested. But in the end, they only got about halfway up the Ramu. On the 8th of September, Adachi ordered the 20th Division's commander, Major General Masutaro Nakai, to move a regimental battle group up the Ramu Valley with the objective of linking up with the retreating 51st Division, which he hoped could bypass the Allied position at Nadzab. Within days, this force of 3,500 men, composed of the 78th Regiment of the 20th Division and a battalion of the 26th Field Artillery Regiment with 12 75mm guns, were advancing up the Ramu towards the airfield at Kayapit. But Adachi's real concern was his left flank. The coast of the Huon Peninsula was largely undeveloped, with only a couple of major port towns that could sustain large formations. The most important, and most exposed, was Finschhafen. The key to the Vitiaz Strait, the port of Finschhafen had been critical in sustaining the 51st Division around Salamaua. It would be just as important in supporting any Australian drive along the coast. As the orders issued by Imperial General Headquarters on the 2nd of September illustrate, the importance of Finschhafen was just as apparent in Tokyo. Thus, Finschhafen became the primary focus of the 18th Army. As early as the 7th of August, the 80th Regiment of the 20th Division had been moved forward to the Finschhafen area. This formation had been reinforced by the 2nd Battalion of the 238th Infantry Regiment, 41st Division, which had been en route to support the 51st at Salamaua. These 4 infantry battalions were supported by a smaller number of base units, including some marine detachments. This force, approximately half a division in strength, was under the command of Major General Izo Yamada, the 1st Shipping Group Commander. Like many of the Australian divisions during the New Guinea campaign, Japanese formations were flexible. Often numerous units from other parent formations operated under one of the 3 divisional headquarters, which were typically swollen by independent units from base forces or naval detachments. Thus, it's better to think of these divisions as simply the headquarters for all Japanese units in the area, rather than paper divisions with 9 battalions in 3 regiments. In Salamaua and the Huon Peninsula, these formations were actually larger than their paper strength. With the Allied landings around Leh on the 4th and 5th of September, Adachi ordered the main body of the 20th Division to reinforce Yamada's battle group. If the main body of the division could garrison Finschhafen, it would be quite a formidable defensive position. But the only problem was time. Without large numbers of horses or motor transport to facilitate its movement over a typically difficult trail, the advance from Madang to Finschhafen was slow. In fact, it was not thought that the division would reach the area before the 10th of October. Thus, just as General Milford surveyed his new command, the soon-to-be sprawling Allied base at Leh, the Japanese were racing to maneuver their fresh forces into defensible positions. The only question was, would the Australians get there first? As Adachi was struggling to adapt to the new operational picture which confronted him, the Australians were consolidating their newly won possessions. Operation Postern was always a three-phase operation. The first involved the 3rd and 5th Divisions, aided by elements of the US 41st, drawing the Japanese 51st Division into battle in the mountains around Salamaua. The nightmarish terrain and vicious combat around Salamaua meant that Allied elements had to be continuously rotated. Therefore, with Australian brigades constantly rotated through the combat area, in terms of frontline strength, the Allied and Japanese elements were actually evenly matched throughout the battle. Although 2 divisions were committed to the engagement, these were really just a rotation of divisional headquarters, with General Savage's 3rd Division replaced by General Milford's 5th. With Nakano's 51st Division, again actually a conglomeration of various Japanese units, drawn into battle around Salamaua, the Australian 2nd Corps executed Phase 2. Along with the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, the 7th and 9th Australian Divisions executed a daring double envelopment around the town of Leh, a manoeuvre that made the defence of Salamaua essentially impossible. Phase 2 had almost worked to perfection. Although the bulk of the 51st Division had escaped the pincers, Leh and its all-important port and airfield facilities had fallen to the Allies quickly and cheaply. Although this is true for warfare in any time or place, logistical constraints were particularly acute in the Papuan and New Guinea campaigns. The terribly difficult country, combined with the lack of roads and infrastructure, meant that the possession of the few ports and towns in the theatre was absolutely critical in sustaining Allied or Japanese forces on the scale of corps and field armies. With Leh and the airfield at Nadzab now in Allied hands, Phase 3 could begin, the Huon Peninsula campaign. The 7th and 9th Divisions were not only fresh and at almost full strength, but these were Australia's premier fighting formations. Along with the 6th Division, these forces were elite, all-volunteer Australian Imperial Force units. By late 1943, they were some of the most battle-tested units in the whole Western Alliance. The 7th Division especially probably had more jungle warfare experience than any divisional-sized unit in the Pacific. Both were now operating as jungle divisions, a new formation introduced by the Australian Army that was optimised for operations in the Pacific. Qualitatively, these formations were amongst the best in the entire British Commonwealth, and were certainly the premier forces in the Southwest Pacific area. General Thomas Blamey, the Southwest Pacific Area Land Force Commander and architect of Operation Postern, had specifically kept these formations uncommitted in the Salamaua area. Rather than being the end of the operation, the pincer attack on Leh had always been the beginning of the next, with fresh and experienced elite forces now poised to attack towards Madang. If this Japanese base could be taken, then the Allies would have broken the back of the Japanese defences in the Southwest Pacific. Major General George Vassey's 7th Division had been airlifted into the Markham Valley. From here, he was in prime position to advance up the Markham and approach Madang from the south. However, the 7th Division's primary task was first and foremost a defensive one. The Markham Valley, especially Nadzab, was perfect terrain for a large-scale airbase, and MacArthur and Kenny, the Southwest Pacific Area Air Force Commander, had viewed the rapid development of the area as critical to supporting further operations. Thus, protecting the newly developed airfield from any Japanese attack down the Markham was Vassey's prime directive. In order to secure Nadzab, the 7th Division had to push its forward elements up the valley in order to give their positions more depth, something of vital importance if the Japanese were planning on a large-scale counterattack. Although Vassey and Herring, the 1st Corps commander, did not know it at the time, the Japanese were doing just that. The reinforced 78th Regiment was already advancing up the Ramu, and if the airfields around Kayapit were not taken before they arrived, supporting intense combat operations from Nadzab would have been highly problematic. Another problem facing Vassey was how dispersed his division was. The 25th Brigade was returning from Leh to Nadzab. The 21st Brigade was strung out along the mountains, vainly trying to prevent the Japanese escape, and the 18th Brigade was still waiting in Port Moresby. The final constraining factor was aircraft. Vassie could not count on the support of the 5th Air Force, which was heavily committed around Finschhafen. Thus, the 7th Division could simply not support large enough forces for a rapid advance up the valley if the main defences were heavily occupied. But the infantry battalions of the 7th Division were not the only Australian units in the Markham Valley. Along with the Line infantry battalions, there were Commandos of the 2nd 6th Independent Company. Australia's first special forces, and styled on their British namesakes, these commando elements were optimised for independent operations in the thick jungles of the Southwest Pacific. Early in the war, they had been designed for covert operations. As the name would suggest, each independent company, which was about a third of a battalion in strength, would operate alone, often behind enemy lines, conducting raids, ambushes, and sabotage. These formations had been particularly effective around Wau and Salamaua. Independent companies were all volunteer units, drawn from the Army's elite AIF divisions. Commandos were hardy men, fit, motivated, and aggressive. At the Army's Special Warfare School in Victoria's frigid Wilson's Promontory, the independent companies were treated to some of the most difficult training the Army could provide. With the growing emphasis on jungle operations, this was later supplemented with specialised training in Far North Queensland. However, as the war developed and the Australian Army's doctrine evolved, the role of the Commandos was rapidly changing. As noted previously, the reforms of 1943 had introduced a whole new divisional structure to the Australian Army. 6 of its mainline divisions, a formation that would constitute the first Australian Army, were converted to jungle pattern divisions. Operations in 1942 had found the standard British pattern infantry division to be poorly suited to operations in Papua and New Guinea. The large allocation of artillery and motor vehicles, upon which the infantry typically relies so much, were condemned by the lack of roads to remain in base areas, whilst the infantry battalions fought unsupported. In the precipitous mountains of New Guinea, if a weapon could not be carried by a man, typically it was simply not used. To redress this shortcoming, these new formations had most of their supporting assets, such as motor vehicles and artillery, removed, drastically reducing the size of the division and its logistical footprint. To compensate, the individual infantry battalions were allocated more 3-inch mortars and Vickers guns. Although these new, much lighter divisions could now completely operate in the mountainous jungles of New Guinea, they also had most of their firepower taken away from them. For example, the typical 3 artillery regiments had been reduced to 1, meaning 24 25-pounder artillery pieces as opposed to 72. Most of the time, the new lighter organisation would be perfectly adequate, but there would be certainly some situations where more firepower would be required. To offset this problem, these supporting assets, such as armour and artillery regiments, were concentrated at the corps or field army level. This ingenious new organisation led to a highly flexible formational structure, where the individual jungle divisions could be rapidly augmented with heavier elements, like tanks or engineers, if the mission demanded. Largely the invention of Generals Blamey and Northcote, the new jungle division and corps structure was a highly successful innovation that, along with a heavy emphasis on jungle warfare training and specific jungle warfare doctrine, was quickly making the Australian Army the premier jungle fighting force in the world. With this new corps and divisional structure, the role of the independent companies also began to change. Rather than acting as independent units operating behind enemy lines, with the shift to the strategic offensive, the Commandos were now concentrated at the corps and field army level. Along with armour and additional artillery regiments, the independent companies would now be attached to line infantry divisions to support specific missions and campaigns. Here they would give the divisional commander a dedicated recon and special forces element that could operate with far less support and move far more quickly than the regular infantry battalions. Several independent companies were allocated to the 7th and 9th Divisions for operations in the Huon Peninsula. Along with other elements of the 7th Division, the Commandos of the 2nd 6th Independent Company had spent several weeks waiting in Port Moresby. On the 14th of September, they had been moved to marshalling yards only to spend 3 days waiting for the weather to clear. The entry of the company's diary for the 16th summed up the situation, getting a bit monotonous. The weather broke on the 17th. On board 13 C-47 Dakota transports, the Commandos were headed for the combat area, their second tour in New Guinea. The company's commander, Captain King, a 25-year-old university student from Gordon, New South Wales, had been given orders by Vassie that he was to proceed to Sangan, about 75 kilometres up the Markham Valley, where his company would be inserted directly by aircraft. One of the great advantages of the Markham Valley is the plain is, in places, flat and grassy enough that a C-47 could land in unprepared airstrips, greatly increasing the utility of the Allies' air superiority and allowing the Australians to rapidly insert forces by air. Essentially, because a C-47 could land in many places in this area, the whole division could manoeuvre as easily as parachute elements. Waiting for King's Commandos at Sangan were elements of the Papuan Infantry Battalion. Along with elements of the 2nd 7th Independent Company, these Papuan forces had been critical in providing reconnaissance on Japanese movements, a task for which the native men were eminently suited. They had played a critical role in the Leh operation. Although 2 Dakotas were damaged during the landing, the company was inserted into the Markham without incident. The Papuans reported that Kaya Pit was held by approximately 200 Japanese, who had cut down the grass on the old airstrip there. On the 18th, General Vassie flew directly to King using a Piper Cub to appraise the situation. Quickly realizing the opportunity that sat before them, Vassie decided upon bold action. If the Kaya Pit airfield could be seized before it could be strongly reinforced, the 7th Division would dominate the whole Markham Valley and have a firm logistical base with which to attack down the Ramu. In his typically straightforward and laconic style, he ordered King to go to Kaya Pit quickly, clean up the Japs and inform Division, adding that as soon as the airbase was captured, the whole 21st Brigade would be flown in. King needed little encouragement. Just 2 days later, he had moved the Independent Company, accompanied by a section of Papuan rifles, to the outskirts of Kaya Pit. Although the movement was not especially long, about 15 kilometres, the heat and thick grass took its toll on the men. By 3:30 p.m, King had his company forming up in an assembly area roughly 1,200 metres to the south of the main Japanese defences. Its strength was around 190 men. Given the need to take the airfield before it could be reinforced, King decided to attack without sending in patrols to reconnoitre the position. Instead, the Commandos would rely upon surprise. The officers formed up the men in the cover of tall kunai grass. The attack was led by Captain Blaney's platoon, which advanced in loose, skirmish order over a wide front. As the Commandos silently marched through the tall grass, they encountered the first Japanese positions, a line of foxholes and rifle pits. Kaya Pit, like many Papuan towns, was actually an interconnected set of small villages, each dispersed by a few hundred metres. Here there were 3 small concentrations of huts that constituted the main Japanese positions. At Kaya Pit, the Commandos employed a now well-rehearsed set of Australian small unit tactics. The platoon attacked in a line of 3 sections, with 1 in reserve. As the front line made contact with Japanese infantry in the first village, the reserve section rapidly wheeled around the right flank of the line and fell upon the Japanese flank. With the startled defenders engaged to their front, they were unable to respond to the flanking attack, and within minutes, the Commandos were in between the Japanese positions, clearing them one at a time with grenade and bayonet. By 5 p.m, the company had cleared the whole village. They had killed 11 Japanese men for the loss of 2 killed in action and 7 wounded, including Captain King, who had been leading the attack. Despite his inferior numbers, the attack had been so rapid and so unexpected that many Japanese had simply fled, leaving behind large amounts of equipment and materiel. By evening, the Commandos had dug in and were holding all 3 hamlets and the airfield. At dusk, a native man approached the line waving a white flag. He handed the Australians a letter written in Japanese, but was shot when he tried to run. The document was later translated to read, "We believe there are friendly troops in Kaya Pit. If so, how many and what units?" Clearly, Japanese command had no idea the town had fallen, or even that Allied units were active in the area. A few hours later, a body of Japanese infantry approached the Australian perimeter, talking loudly with their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. 6 were gunned down at point-blank range before the remainder retreated in panic. The next day, an actual counterattack materialized. The company had contracted its overnight perimeter to the number 1 village. King had been intending to occupy the rest of Kaya Pit and begin work on the airstrip that morning. But before his men left their bivouac positions, a Japanese force attacked from the west. This battalion-sized formation, composed of 2 infantry companies, a machine gun platoon, and engineer company, was the vanguard of the 78th Regiment, which was advancing from the Japanese roadhead in the Ramu Valley. Clearly, they had sent the message to Kayapit the day before. Before King could gain a good understanding of the situation, battle erupted along Watson's platoon's front. The Commandos were engaged by hundreds of Japanese infantry, but the attack was poorly executed and easily broken up by the company's automatic weapons. The 2nd 6th after-action report characterized the Japanese attack thusly: a hell of a lot of firing and shouting, but very little offensive spirit shown. With the Japanese attack stopped cold by the company's Bren guns, King decided upon a counterattack, despite being almost out of ammunition. Watson's platoon charged into the advancing enemy, driving them back 200 meters before they were halted by heavy automatic fire to their front. Again, the Commandos executed their trademark right flank attack. As Watson's platoon engaged the Japanese to their front, Blaney's men moved around the right to Mission Hill. With the superior Japanese force now trapped between the two commando elements, their flanking attack immediately broke. Essentially out of ammunition, Watson's platoon was still pinned by the enemy to their front, holding the second village. Only after a skerrick of rifle ammunition was brought forward were they encouraged enough to resume the attack. They were led by a fine young officer, Lieutenant Bladderstone, a 23-year-old jackaroo from Narrandera, New South Wales, who charged alone through 70 metres of open ground and cleared 3 machine gun positions with grenades. Bladderstone was awarded the Military Cross for his actions at Kayapit. This bold display of fighting spirit broke the Japanese attack, the survivors fleeing west into the safety of the tall grass. Despite being virtually out of ammunition, King's men had smashed the Japanese attacking force. They counted over 250 Japanese bodies and estimated that a further 50 lay in the surrounding kunai grass. Equipment captured included 19 light and heavy machine guns, 150 rifles, 6 grenade throwers, 12 swords, and a trove of documents. Australian casualties had been 14 killed and 23 wounded, including King himself. The Commandos had won a significant victory, but they desperately needed resupply and reinforcement. King's effective strength was now less than 140 in the village itself. He had been desperately trying to contact Vassie, but radio communications had been unreliable. Luckily, that afternoon, a runner had made contact with the Papuan section at Sangan, who did have contact with 7th Division headquarters. Delighted by King's success, Vassie informed him that he would bring forward reinforcements the next day. After a long night of skirmishing with small elements of Japanese, the exhausted Commandos and Papuans began preparing the airstrip for C-47 operations, and by nightfall, the whole 2nd 16th Battalion, a unit of Kokoda track fame, had relieved the Commandos. By bold action and initiative, Kayapit had been taken in just 2 days, and in doing so, the Australians now dominated the whole Markham Valley. The Japanese plans had been to link up with the retreating 51st Division, which was intending to use the minor tracks along the northern slopes of the Sarawagad Range, but this was now impossible. With Kayapit in Australian hands, the only option was through the mountains. Of more significance was the airfield. With a C-47 capable airstrip, large Australian forces could now be supported in the upper Markham Valley, which would be critical in any advance into the Ramu, where the newly built Japanese road awaited them. The most remarkable thing was that this had all been achieved by King's 190 commandos and a few platoons of Papuan rifles. Through their dominance of the air, rapid manoeuvre and a bold attack, this tiny force had beaten the Japanese to the punch, securing and reinforcing the vital airfield before the main strength of the 78th Regiment arrived, firmly grasping the initiative in the process. When Generals MacArthur and Kenny learned of the Australian actions at Kayapit, they were so delighted that Kenny offered to fly the Commandos in a plane load full of whatever the men desired. In due course, a specially packed C-47 landed in Kayapit, full of chocolate, soft drinks, cigarettes, books, and magazines. Vassie was not slow to exploit this success. Within days, he had ordered Brigadier Doherty to advance into the Ramu, and by the 22nd, they had crossed the Markham-Ramu divide, little more than a small plateau in the middle of the valley. Doherty's advance down the Ramu was again a showcase of typical Australian infantry doctrine. The advance of his main strength was preceded by numerous and wide-ranging infantry patrols. Commandos of the 2nd 6th and 2nd 7th Independent Companies ranged down both sides of the valley, waging small battles with elements of Japanese infantry. This drastically confused the operational picture facing Japanese command. As contact reports came in from all over the valley, it was very hard for them to accurately estimate Australian strength or their intentions. The enemy seemed to be everywhere. After a dangerous crossing of the Umi River, a tributary of the Ramu, the 2nd 16th Battalion found the village of Sangarak deserted. With what appeared to be strong Australian forces in the upper Markham Valley, and Adachi's order that the defence of Finschhafen was to be the main effort, Major General Nakai decided to essentially abandon the Ramu Valley to the Australians, who were advancing rapidly and gaining in strength. He would hold the Kankirio Saddle, a formidable defensive position on the slopes of the Finisterre Range, which dominates the north side of the Ramu Valley. After all, with all available Japanese forces desperately trying to reinforce Finschhafen, he only had a regimental battle group with which to oppose the 7th Division. This made perfect sense from an operational perspective, but it meant abandoning most of the road the division had spent the last year building, a road that would now supply the advancing Australians. Vassie noted the slackening resistance. By the 30th of September, he had 2 brigades in the area, with the 25th at Kayapit and the 21st now advancing on Dumpu. In just 10 days, the 7th Division had advanced some 150 kilometres, and was now approaching the mountain passes to the south of Madang. However, despite this success, Vassie was ordered to slow down. Herring and the 2nd Corps commander, General Morshead, warned Vassie not to become too involved in the Ramu. They were sending everything they could to support the 9th Division at Finschhafen, and simply lacked the logistical assets to supply 2 major battles at once. Indeed, the attentions of Generals Adachi, Nakai, Herring, and Morshead was now firmly fixed on Finschhafen, where the 9th and 20th Divisions were locked in an extremely closely contested battle, and the Australians faced disaster and defeat. Operation Postern itself had been predicated on the wider campaign objectives given to New Guinea Force by MacArthur and GHQ. Issued on the 13th of June 1943, MacArthur's operational instruction for the wider Allied offensive stated that forces of the Southwest Pacific Area, supported by South Pacific forces, will seize the Lae, Salamaua, Finschhafen, Markham River Valley area and establish major elements of the Air Force therein to provide from the Markham Valley area general and direct air support of subsequent operations in northern New Guinea and western New Britain, and to control Vitiaz Strait and protect the northwestern flank of subsequent operations in western New Britain. The campaign plan formulated by Blamey and Herring for the Salamaua and Lae operation was highly detailed. However, MacArthur and other American staff officers voiced significant concerns over the lack of Australian planning for follow-on operations. Neither Blamey nor Herring had given all that much thought to a follow-on attack on Finschhafen, instead preferring to await results at Lae. After all, any move towards Finschhafen and Sio would be entirely dependent upon Japanese dispositions which could not be accurately forecasted. What if the 51st Division decided to make a stand at Lae, just as the South Seas Detachment had fought to the death at Buna Gona? In that eventuality, the 9th Division would most probably be embroiled in a grueling, month-long battle to take the Japanese base, completely rendering any prior plans obsolete. American displeasure with Australian planning for the Huon Peninsula campaign was really a result of a significant difference in organisational culture. MacArthur, and the American generals more generally, preferred a far more rigid command structure, where lower-level officers were expected to follow detailed campaign plans and provide constant situation reports to GHQ. The Australians, on the other hand, had far more confidence in an officer corps that was filled by battle-hardened and seasoned men. Local commanders were given far more leeway in how to conduct their own operations, and Australian generals were confident in their ability to adapt to new situations and take advantage of any opportunities that presented themselves. Blamey recalled his thinking later. In the early stages of planning, the operation necessary for the capture of Finschhafen had been studied, but completed plans were not prepared, since its capture would be dependent on the amount of enemy resistance encountered at Lae, and the length of time necessary to reduce it. It was considered that, if the capture of Lae was effected quickly, a brigade group from 9th Australian Division could be used to carry out the operation against Finschhafen. Although detailed plans had not been made for a follow-on operation, Generals Blamey, Herring and Wooten had all agreed that if things went well around Lae, that the 9th Division would move rapidly along the coast towards the next Japanese position. As it turned out, as Nakano's 51st Division had fled in what could be described as a rout, just such an opportunity now presented itself. With his eyes firmly focused on the Admiralties, northern New Guinea and breaking out into the Bismarck Sea, MacArthur urged the Australians to move on Finschhafen as soon as possible. Blamey and Herring agreed that a single brigade should attack the area as soon as feasible. As with all things in the New Guinea campaign, the problem was logistics, specifically amphibious transport. Rear Admiral Barbie informed the Australians that he could not provide sufficient landing craft to move a brigade, roughly 3,500 men, for at least 10 days after the Ley operation. Thus, the date for the Finschhafen offensive was set. Even as the 9th Division was going ashore around Ley, its commanders were warned that they should be ready to make a rapid move to the east. The division commander, Major General Wooten, told one of his brigadiers to have a look at Finschhafen on a map, as it may be of interest to him later. On the 17th of September, Herring, the Australian 1st Corps commander, arrived at Ley by PT boat. He ordered Wooten to prepare an immediate attack at Finschhafen with one brigade group. By 9 am on the 18th, planning for the operation had begun in earnest. The attack at Finschhafen was a crystalline example of the flexibility and adaptability of the Australian Army, and the 9th Division in particular. Given the inherent complexity of amphibious operations, the 9th Division's ability to plan and execute a contested amphibious landing, one that was to be conducted at night, against a position that had barely been reconnoitred, within just 4 days, was truly exceptional. Wooten selected the 20th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Windeyer, as this had been one of the lead brigades in the Ley landing, and was thus intimately familiar with amphibious operations. The major problem facing the Australians was the lack of accurate information on Japanese strength in the Finschhafen area. Wooten was concerned about leaving a single brigade exposed 100 kilometres up the coast, and thus wanted the attack to be made by 2 brigades, but this was rejected by MacArthur, who thought Japanese strength in the area was weak. Confusing the matter was the fact that different intelligence branches of different headquarters produced vastly different Japanese strength estimates. General Headquarters intelligence staff estimated that there were only 350 Japanese personnel in the target area, although the 9th Division's own assessment was far more accurate, between 4,000 and 1,500. The rapid move towards Finschhafen was designed to take it before it could be reinforced. However, as noted previously, Adachi had already significantly increased the size of the Finschhafen garrison, and the main body of the 20th Division was en route. On the day of the landings at Finschhafen, Japanese strength in the area would be over 5,000, significantly outnumbering the 20th Brigade's frontline infantry strength. Finschhafen's particular geography limited the possible landing beaches. In this area, the coast is dominated by 20-foot high cliffs and coral reefs, dramatically limiting the potential landing areas. There were 2 operationally significant elements in the Finschhafen area: the town of Finschhafen itself, along with its harbour, and the small village of Sattelberg through which the main coastal road ran. On the coast, to the north of Finschhafen, was a 500-metre-long sandy cove at the mouth of the Song River. This area, which was codenamed Scarlet Beach, was selected as the primary landing zone. The 20th Brigade would be lifted by a force of 4 APDs, which were converted destroyers, 15 landing craft infantry, and 3 landing ship tanks. The force itself would be composed of 3 battle groups, the nucleus of which was the brigade's 3 infantry battalions, which were each supported by a battery of 25-pounders from the 2nd 12th Field Regiment, an engineer platoon from the 2nd 3rd Field Company, and a dressing station from the 2nd 8th Field Ambulance. The initial landing would be made on a 2-battalion front, with the 3rd landing soon after H hour. The beachhead would be held by the 10th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery and a platoon of the 2nd Machine Gun Battalion. An understrength company of the Papuan Infantry Battalion would provide the brigade with a dedicated reconnaissance force. The plan for the landing was badly complicated by the discovery of a sandbar off the southern end of Scarlet Beach, which would prevent the use of LSTs in this area. Thus, the whole plan had to be amended, with less stores and supplies put ashore than originally intended. It had taken just 7 days from the completion of the Ley operation for Windeyer and his staff to completely reorient the 20th Brigade for a new mission, one which none of them had been prepared to undertake. Given the complexity and difficulty of amphibious operations, the adaptability and general quality of the 9th Division as a whole was clearly on display well before battle had even been joined. By midnight on the 21st of September, the men of the 20th Brigade were once again aboard ship. They had begun loading at 4 p.m, and it would be another sleepless night for the Rats of Tobruk as they approached yet another battle. Unusually for a large-scale amphibious assault, the Scarlet Beach landing was a nighttime operation. This time was selected as to protect the landing force from air attack, and whilst it did allow the Armada to approach Finschhafen unmolested by Japanese aircraft, the darkness imposed confusion and increased the complexity of an already difficult operation. The target beach was about 600 metres in length and 40 metres wide. It was bordered on the north by the mouth of the Song River. The port and township of Finschhafen lay about 8 kilometres to the south, which could only be approached along a thin coastal plain around 1 kilometre in width, with the ocean on the left and the towering jungle-covered mountains on the right. The landing itself was an eerie experience for the men of the 20th Brigade. As the landing force approached the beach, they could see nothing more than the moonlit silhouette of the mountains and coastline. Even the other landing craft were lost in the darkness. It seemed to many as though they were approaching a hostile shoreline all alone. 5 minutes before H hour, the darkness was broken by the fire of 5 destroyers, which drenched the landing zone with high explosive, the red 40mm tracers screaming towards the beach like giant fireflies. The landing was contested. As the landing craft approached the beach, they were met with heavy Japanese fire. A number of entrenched medium machine guns on the north end of the beach greeted the Australians, but, despite its volume, this fire was generally inaccurate and ineffective. As the landing craft hit the beach, they were predictably confused. The nighttime operation had led to many companies landing in the wrong area, leading to the intermixing of the battalions. Furthermore, the whole force landed to the left of the intended beach, both predictable outcomes of a nighttime attack. This had been done at the Navy's request, in spite of Windeye's objections, who was concerned about the potential for disorder to befall his formation. Most of the coxswains were simply ordered to land wherever they could. But the men of the 9th Division had been trained for situations like these. If they were landed at the wrong beach, as had happened at Gallipoli, their objective was simply to engage and destroy any enemy elements in their vicinity, and, only then, to try and sort themselves out. They would need to put this training to use at Scarlet Beach. The 4 assaulting companies were not only landed in the wrong area of Scarlet Beach, but were hopelessly intermixed. The attack on the right flank went generally to plan, but in the centre of the line, elements of the 2nd 13th and 2nd 17th battalions were so confused that it was decided that the best course of action was simply to advance inland and await daybreak, which allowed the other 2 companies to move off the beach. Only Huget's platoon encountered serious resistance at the beach itself. It was heavily engaged by a pair of medium machine gun nests. In the tough, close-range nighttime engagement, Huget was aided by Lieutenant Herman A. Colin, an American amphibious scout who had also been landed in the wrong place. In a distinguished action, rather than leaving to find his parent unit, Colin decided to stay and fight, aiding the Australians as they cleared the beach with grenades and bayonets. As the assaulting waves had been landed too far to the left, they were unable to engage the primary Japanese defensive positions which dominated the beach. The second wave was composed of larger LCIs, or landing craft infantry, which encountered heavy fire as they approached the north end of the beach. With this fire inflicting casualties, these larger craft also veered to the left. However, there was a large sandbar which prevented the landing. Consequently, the craft dropped their ramps into patches of deep water. As the assaulting infantry waded through chest-deep water, they were sitting ducks for the intact beach defences. Only the heavy, close-range fire of the LCIs averted disaster, as the American crews drenched the Japanese positions with 20mm shells. Despite all of this confusion, Scarlet Beach was quickly cleared. The men and junior officers all went ashore with an aggressive mindset. No matter who they were with or where they were, all knew their job was to close with the enemy and kill him. This low-level initiative and high fighting spirit meant that the beach defences were rapidly assaulted by groups of soldiers from, in some cases, different battalions, under officers which were largely unknown to them. By 6:30 am, the beach and immediate jungle had been secured. Windeyer held the beachhead some 1,500 metres wide and 300 metres deep, but it would take a few hours to redress the disordered state of his command and begin offensive operations towards Finschhafen. Indeed, even the reserve battalion, the 2nd 15th, landed in a similar fashion. 3 hours after landing, Lieutenant Colonel Grace was not sure of the whereabouts of 2 of his companies, Captain Christie's and Captain Snell's. The other 2 companies, Captain Angus and Major Newcomb's, were with battalion headquarters, concentrated in the area between Katika and Scarlet Beach. Park's company was the first to attack Katika, a village to the immediate south of the beachhead. As he moved along the main track, Captain Pike came across the small group of huts that were his immediate objective. His lead platoon had clashed with elements of Japanese infantry in the area, and thus he decided to execute a flank attack. With one platoon ordered to fix the Japanese defences frontally, the rest of the company began moving to the left flank. As they did so, they were met with heavy flanking fire from Japanese positions to his left. The two forces had been attempting to outflank the other, leading to a confused meeting engagement. In the face of strong Japanese positions, Pike's men fell back to regroup. With another company in support, the Australians attacked again at 10 am, but once more were forced to withdraw. Brigadier Wendaya, now realising that Katika was strongly held, ordered the reserve battalion to clear the village. But the ferocity of the morning's fighting had convinced the Japanese that their position was untenable. When the 2nd 15th made its attack at 3 o'clock, all they found were deserted weapon pits and 8 Japanese bodies. As night fell on the first day of the Battle of Finschhafen, Wendaya had achieved all of his Phase 1 objectives. The beachhead was secure and firmly held. The 3 battalions had redressed the disorder of the previous evening and were all on their objectives. The critical villages and high grounds surrounding Scarlet Beach were all held by Australian units. To the north, elements of the Papuan Infantry Battalion were operating in the jungle, keeping a close eye on enemy movement along the main track to Sattelberg. 8 guns of the 2nd 12th Field Regiment were now in place and bombarding Finschhafen with 25-pounder fire. By the next morning, the whole regiment would be in action, and the Bofors guns of Major Pagan's 2nd 4th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, less 1 battery, some 489 men, were covering the beach. These were reinforced by Captain Nicholas, whose company of the 2nd Machine Gun Battalion provided 12 Vickers guns for beach defence. With these forces now at the beach itself, and the sappers of the 2nd 3rd Field Company busily constructing bridges and roads inland, Wendaya was now free to advance with his infantry battalions. In all, American naval records state that on the 22nd of September, total forces landed on Scarlet Beach amounted to 5,300 troops, 180 vehicles, 32 guns, and 850 tons of stores comprising 15 days' rations and 12 days' ammunition. 150 kilometers to the southeast, the invasion convoy sailed towards the safe waters of Buna and Milne Bay. The Japanese had been caught off guard by the movement of the 20th Brigade to Finschhafen. Although they were clearly expecting an attack in this area, the speed of the operation surprised them. The successful landing of the Australian forces in the area stung the 4th Air Army into action. Now steaming in daylight, the Armada was attacked by swarms of enemy aircraft, more than 70 in total. Orbiting the American task force were 3 squadrons of fighters. However, at the time, this force was in the process of being relieved. Thus, the Japanese happened to attack when 5 squadrons of P-38s were defending the formation. Aided by the fighter controllers on board USS Reed, which was again acting as a radar picket, the Japanese were savaged. With scores of American fighters diving on them from above, and thus with a decisive energy advantage, their attack was immediately broken up. American pilots claimed 10 bombers and 29 fighters for the loss of 3 P-38s. Anti-aircraft fire shot down 9 of the 10 torpedo bombers that approached under the radar horizon and thus avoided decimation by the fighters. These kill claims may well be excessive, but we can be sure that not a single hit was scored on the task force, and the Japanese aircraft suffered heavy losses. After this clear demonstration of the power of the 5th Air Force, 7th Fleet commanders were far less reluctant to deploy their surface forces in the Solomon and Bismarck Seas by day. With his command now well organised and supported, Wendaya began advancing on his primary objective, Finschhafen. Captured documents had indicated that there were around 3 infantry companies holding the Scarlet Beach area when the Australians attacked, all from the 80th Regiment. These had been supported by a pair of 75mm mountain guns. The primary axis of attack was the coastal track which ran from Sattelberg to Finschhafen Harbour. At 8 am on the 23rd, the 2nd 15th began advancing south along the coastal plain. Like much of Papua New Guinea, these coastal plains were regularly crossed by rivers, each one of which made ideal defensive positions. Contested river crossings are some of the most difficult operations in modern warfare. Not only is the infantry vulnerable whilst making the crossing itself, slowed as they are by the wet ground, rivers are devoid of cover, making them ideal killing zones. Then, once across, the lead element will always be isolated with insecure lines of communications, which leaves them vulnerable to counterattack. In the 10 or so kilometres between Scarlet Beach and Finschhafen, there were 2 major rivers, the Kokoda and Bumi, and here the Japanese had entrenched. The battalion found the Kokoda undefended, and by midday, lead elements of the 2nd 15th Battalion had reached the much more substantial Bumi. One of the scouts, Corporal Tart, a farmhand from Tanimorel, Queensland, advanced through the thick undergrowth to the north bank of the Bumi. As he surveyed the crossing, he was killed by a rifle shot. Tart's section was immediately engaged by heavy automatic fire from the south bank, where the Japanese were evidently holding very strong positions dominating the river. Colonel Grace, the 2nd 15th CO, immediately realised the strength of the Japanese position. With well-sighted machine guns dominating the river, any attempt at a contested crossing would only lead to a bloodbath, especially with the limited resources available to the Australians. Thus, he immediately decided upon a flanking manoeuvre. The use of manoeuvre was a core concept which was now foundational to the Australian Army's jungle warfare doctrine. Years of fighting the Japanese had shown the value of immediate flank attacks. In the jungle, enemy positions were rarely a continuous front, but rather a number of concentrations. Experience had shown that the enemy could be compelled to abandon even the most formidable positions if they could be rapidly outflanked. Grace ordered a force of 2 infantry companies, supported by a platoon of pioneers, to attack the Japanese position via a wide right hook. This would mean not only scaling the jungle-covered mountains there, but blazing a trail whilst doing so. This area was nothing more than virgin wilderness. They left the battalion at 4 p.m. It took the men over 2 hours to advance just 800 metres, slashing their way through the nearly impenetrable undergrowth as they went. The terrain was so steep that the medics decided to leave all but 2 of their stretchers halfway up. By 6 p.m, they had gained the ridge and advanced south to a position called Maketi's OP. Windaya, hearing of the ominous terrain in the hills above the coastal track, decided that a direct crossing would be the preferred option, as moving through the mountains was simply too slow. Thus, he ordered the 2nd 15th Battalion to secure a bridgehead with the forces available. The 2nd 13th, which was now approaching the Bumi from the north, would then advance through the 2nd 15th's positions and capture Finschhafen. Grace was unwilling to attack the positions that had already been reconnoitred, and thus ordered a number of patrols to investigate the upstream Japanese positions. Finding a gap in the defences, one patrol was able to effectively cross the river. They only met Japanese sniper fire. By midday, a formed company attack went in at this location, sustaining only 3 casualties in the process. Evidently, despite the strength of the Japanese positions along the main coastal track, they had not enjoyed enough time to deploy their forces along the whole line of the river. However, despite the successful river crossing, there would be no quick capture of Finschhafen. By the 26th, ominous signs were emerging all around the Australian position. As a company advanced inland towards Sattelberg, they encountered very strong Japanese opposition holding well-positioned defences along the Sattelberg Road. Of more concern was the ever-increasing Japanese patrol activity in this area, which successfully cut the Australian telephone wires twice. 20th Brigade staff estimated that a force of battalion strength was operating around Sattelberg. Windaya ordered Captain Main to pull his company back to a clearing at the junction of the Sattelberg and Turco track, which would serve as an excellent defensive position. With his main infantry strength engaged to the south, the simultaneous capture of Sattelberg and Finschhafen was deemed to be impossible. Indeed, elements of 3 Japanese battalions had been identified, indicating a force of regimental strength in the area. Rather than facing a minor garrison as MacArthur's headquarters had predicted, the Australians were not even operating at a force ratio advantage. It was now clear to Windaya that his brigade had landed in the area right as the Japanese were in the process of reinforcing it, although no one knew the scale of the enemy forces that would all too rapidly arrive. At this time, the beachhead was only held by anti-aircraft elements and a company of machine guns. All of the available infantry units were advancing on the brigade's objectives. To the south, as the Queenslanders moved to exploit their success, they ran into heavy opposition around the Salankawa plantation. Here the Japanese were occupying several high ground positions that were effectively dominating the newly established bridgehead. These had to be cleared before the 2nd 13th Battalion could exploit towards Finschhafen. After a 10-minute long artillery and mortar bombardment, they attacked at 3 p.m. The 2nd 15th advanced with 2 companies in line abreast, Stewart's on the left and Snell's on the right. Rather than a charge, the men of the 2nd 15th literally crawled towards the enemy, clambering over thick bamboo and vines. The Japanese position was on the other side of a deep ravine, and the infantry literally crashed into the valley floor, tumbling over the nearly impassable undergrowth. Here they formed up for the final push. The Japanese position was emplaced in a thick bamboo grove, making artillery observation difficult. As the men charged up the steep slope, they were engaged by an elite Japanese formation, an element of Special Naval Landing Force troops, Japanese Marines. With the Australian infantry slowed by the thick bamboo, the Marines began to shower them with grenades. By some miracle, barely any of these weapons actually detonated. Many had been corrupted by the harsh tropical conditions. Had they been in working order, casualties would have been devastating, but as events turned out, the Queenslanders had made it halfway up without sustaining significant losses. The failure of their weapons unnerved the Japanese. Although they opened up on the attackers with all of their small arms, the Australians were now too close. With hundreds of glistening bayonets now almost upon them, the Japanese Marines broke and fled. This force should have been able to hold a position of this quality against a battalion attack, but in the end, the boldness of the 2nd 15th and the unreliability of their weapons created panic. Australian reports of the engagement note the height of the Marines. They were much taller than average Japanese soldiers. The attack on the 26th had been extremely effective. 3 13mm guns and 7 light machine guns had been captured. Some 52 fallen Japanese Marines were buried and many more were later found in the surrounding undergrowth. The 2nd 15th inflicted an estimated 100 casualties during the attack for the loss of 3 men killed in action, who were all old originals, and 7 wounded. With this high ground position now in Windeya's hands, all of the Japanese defences in the plantation were dominated by the Australians. But this hardly meant an end to the battle. Just 2 hours later, the 2nd 13th Battalion executed a follow-on attack, but were halted by heavy and accurate machine gun fire coming from other high ground positions. As the Australian battalion slowly advanced towards Finschhafen, Windeya was becoming increasingly concerned about his ever-lengthening flank. With increasing Japanese activity on his right around Sattelberg, a real threat to Scarlet Beach was beginning to manifest. However, with only a brigade tasked with capturing both Sattelberg and Finschhafen, in addition to holding the beachhead, Windeya had no infantry units to spare. His entire brigade reserve constituted just 2 companies that were concentrated to the south of Scarlet Beach. But if a strong force of Japanese attacked from Sattelberg, the 20th Brigade faced the real possibility of losing their logistical base. But Windeya's orders were to take Finschhafen, and thus he could not withdraw major formations from the southern advance, especially as those that were currently deployed were only making slow progress. Another battalion was advancing overland from a beachhead on the south coast of the Huon Peninsula, the 22nd, but they were still some 30 kilometres away at the Bumi River. These concerns grew all the more grave on the 27th, when a set of Japanese orders were captured. Captain Saranuma, a company commander of the 80th Regiment, was killed in the Kaitika area on the 22nd. The document he carried had only been translated on the 27th. Saranuma was carrying a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Takagi ordering the 3rd Battalion of the 80th Regiment and some elements of the 238th Regiment to attack the Australian position from the Sattelberg Road and Kaitika track. The operation was to be launched on the 26th. According to the letter, Japanese forces were to cut off the enemy at the northeast side of Hellsbach and will annihilate them. Luckily, strong patrol activity from the 2nd 17th Battalion had effectively acted as a spoiling attack, turning the Japanese assault into a confused meeting engagement. Nonetheless, the Japanese intent to attack the 20th Brigade was now evident to all, and Windeya began to desperately request immediate reinforcement. At the very least, he needed an additional battalion to hold the beachhead, in addition to a squadron of tanks to aid in clearing the Japanese defences at the plantation. Although Windeya did not know it at the time, General Blamey had always intended for the rapid reinforcement of the 20th Brigade. In fact, on the 22nd of September, he had issued orders to Herring to that effect, directing New Guinea Force HQ to deploy the 9th Division headquarters and a 2nd Brigade to Finschhafen immediately. On the 23rd, General Herring conferred with Admiral Barbie in order to arrange the movement of Australian forces from Lae. Rather than the cooperation he expected, Herring was informed that additional forces would not be moved to Finschhafen because of a standing order from General Headquarters, which Barbie claimed had directed that no additional amphibious forces should be committed to the Finschhafen operation, and obligations for overwater supply and air force support will be kept to a minimum. This is despite the fact that the commander of the amphibious force was obliged to follow Blamey's orders. Indeed, Annex 3 of GHQ's standing order, that Barbie was using to justify his refusal to aid the Australians, directed that the Allied naval force would continue to provide overwater transportation of personnel, organisation, equipment, materials and supplies to Binocular, Ley, and Diminish, Finschhafen, as required by the commander, Phosphorus. A now increasingly frustrated General Herring later recalled the situation. Under GHQ directions, Amforce was bound to move troops to such places as Commander Phosphorus, Blamey, might direct. Commander Amforce, however, having information that a new order was to be issued by GHQ, refused, and said that he would not move an extra brigade without reference to GHQ. At this stage, also the question of resupply of 20th Brigade at Finschhafen was considered. Before the initial landing, there had been no suggestion that there would be any trouble in this regard. The contrary was rather the case. The commander of Amforce's representative assuring GOC 1st Australian Corps that resupply would take place after 3 or 4 days had elapsed from the initial landing. The position was further complicated at this stage by the departure of Commander Amforce from Buna to Milne Bay and the fact that no officer was left behind within reach of Headquarters 1st Australian Corps to represent him with any real authority. Thus, as the Australian position grew more and more severe around Finschhafen, Windale was denied the reinforcement that had already been arranged. In essence, an American admiral was refusing to follow an Australian command because he was worried about violating MacArthur's orders, despite those orders clearly directing him to provide Blamey with any assistance he required. Compounding the situation was the fact that MacArthur and Blamey were both travelling, and, thus, could not be contacted for clarification. Making matters worse was the fact that both had the tendency to micromanage, meaning neither had delegated the requisite authority to a subordinate. Therefore, as the rest of the 9th Division waited around Ley, Herring tried in vain to convince the Americans of the immediate need to reinforce Windayer. But MacArthur's staff continued to submit that the opposition facing Windayer was small, and that, before any reinforcements were undertaken with the valuable landing craft, information should be supplied which would indicate the strength of hostile forces opposing 20th Infantry Brigade. Consequently, Herring informed General Mackay on the 24th of September that he was unable to comply with Blamey's orders for lack of necessary transport. This problem only persisted as Herring continued to press the issue with the commander of the amphibious force, who again refused to commit to the movement of any additional forces to Finschhafen without GHQ's direct approval, despite the clear nature of the orders as they stood. By the 26th, and with the Australian situation rapidly deteriorating, Herring cabled Blamey in desperation. After 6 days of hard fighting, 20th Infantry Brigade is on a front of 9 miles with a depth of 6 miles. Although successfully launched, the operation is far from completed, and enemy is resisting in numerous bunker strongholds. Frequent enemy air attacks have made operations more difficult besides causing casualties. To carry out the mission of capturing Finschhafen and exploiting Teseo, at least 60 miles along the coast, HQ 9th Australian Division and 2nd Infantry Brigade are required. This was foreseen and ordered by you, and both commanders of New Guinea Force and 1st Australian Corps consider it essential that this be done earliest possible. The question of reinforcements and resupply is now becoming acute, and early action to move above forces is urgently required. By the 27th, even the intervention of Blamey, the Allied Supreme Land Force Commander, Southwest Pacific Area, had not altered the American dispositions. In response to an increasingly concerned General Wooten, the 9th Division CO, who requested the immediate movement of an additional brigade to Scarlet Beach, Herring informed him that the Americans would only agree to the transportation of a single battalion on the night of the 28th. Only one LST would be made available. Eventually, the dispute reached the very highest levels of command, Blamey and MacArthur. On the 28th, Blamey cabled MacArthur reminding him of the agreement of the 17th of September that an additional brigade and Wooten's headquarters should be sent in if necessary, and requested this immediately. MacArthur's reply, sent at 6:15 p.m. that day, said that to accelerate the movement of additional brigades and the 9th Division headquarters would cause disarrangement of amended program upon which we are engaged. If tactical necessity require, it will of course be done at once. I am sure, however, that this is not the case, and that Finschhafen within a reasonable time will be in our hands and without serious loss. Exactly why MacArthur's headquarters was so convinced that the forces facing the Australians were small is still unknown. 3 Japanese battalions had already been identified, and Japanese orders for a counterattack had been captured. In reality, the majority of the 20th Division was quickly approaching Windeyer. It seems as though the need to reinforce Finschhafen was simply inconvenient, as it would have disrupted the grander offensive plans that MacArthur and his staff were now developing, and, thus, despite increasingly desperate Australian requests, they maintained that said disruption was simply not necessary. The men on the front line had no knowledge of the disharmony emerging between their commanders. On the right flank, the Australian units were hard pressed against an enemy that seemed to be increasing in strength. On the 26th, the defenders of the Sattelberg road clearing had to face a massed banzai charge. This time the Japanese infantry screamed Tojo as they charged through Vickers, Bren, rifle, and 25-pounder fire. 6 were killed right on the parapet of the Australian fighting positions. As one day became the next, the Japanese attacks in this sector only grew more fierce. On the 28th, a platoon forward at Jaiveveneng was attacked by a Japanese company group. The assault was made in 3 directions simultaneously. Again, rather than an artillery bombardment, the Japanese used their voices to try and weaken the defences. As opposed to filling the Australians with fear, the loud battle cry did nothing more than reveal the Japanese positions. As they charged Captain Main's men through the cleared ground, they were torn to shreds by well-sighted automatic weapons and disciplined rifle fire. For 5 hours the Japanese attacked, one wave after another, and by 8 p.m. the Australians were running low on ammunition. However, despite a day-long firefight, only 1 Australian had been wounded, and Main estimated that he had inflicted 60 casualties. 20 dead had actually been counted. Despite the ineffectiveness of these company actions, the meagre Australian forces guarding their right flank, essentially 2 rifle companies that were now named Sattel Force, were under ever-increasing pressure. To the south, in the main battle area, the 2nd 13th Battalion moved through the positions gained by the 2nd 15th. The primary Japanese defences were in the plantation along the coast. As was typical, these were extremely formidable, with the now all too familiar palm log bunker making infantry assaults both costly and difficult. Thus, Windeyer decided to outflank the whole position. The high ground movement conducted by the 2nd 15th had given the 20th Brigade a jumping off point for a large right hook. However, doing so would mean another long movement through virgin wilderness along the foothills of the Kruitberg Range. The 2nd 13th would attack towards a major Japanese concentration at a number of positions at the Triangle, Kakakog, and an old ruined hospital called the City, which constituted the main town of Finschhafen. If this area could be taken, then the primary Japanese positions in the plantation would essentially be untenable. The attack began on the 28th. 2 companies of the 2nd 15th moved off at 2 p.m, and by nightfall had advanced about 1,500 metres. The slow pace was not caused by the Japanese defences, but the steepness of the terrain. But as the sun set, the men were digging in on Cooper's Spur, overlooking the triangle. They were halted by torrential rain and an increasingly difficult supply situation. Lines of communication back to Scarlet Beach now ran through kilometres of jungle-covered mountains, through tracks the men had blazed themselves. The companies were disordered, and a thorough reconnaissance of the Japanese defences before them had not yet been completed. In fact, the thinly stretched Australian line was only becoming thinner as the advance created an ever longer flank, one which had to be guarded. At 2 a.m. on the morning of the 29th, badly needed reinforcements finally arrived. On board 3 APDs, 838 men of the fresh 2nd 43rd Battalion arrived off Scarlet Beach. Although certainly not the brigade Windeyer had been hoping for, this new battalion would allow the main strength of the 20th Brigade to concentrate on its immediate objective. The American transports removed 134 walking wounded. However, fearful of a daylight air attack, they left before the most serious casualties could be moved from the inland hospitals and loaded. On board were a troop of tank reconnaissance men. First Corps had allocated armour to Windeyer, but the lack of LSTs prevented these units from moving forward. Nonetheless, the additional forces were a godsend. The 2nd 43rd CO, Colonel Joshua, immediately received the following orders from Brigade Headquarters. You will relieve the troops known as Sattel Force. this relief to be completed as speedily as possible to enable the 2nd 17th Battalion to concentrate for operations against Finschhafen. By the end of the day, the Sattelberg Road area was firmly held by this new battalion, and the hard-pressed men of the 2nd 17th concentrated for the attack on Finschhafen. With his exposed flank now more firmly secure, Windeyer began reorganising his forces for the attack on the plantation. As 3 battalions were now available, the attack would have 3 phases. The first phase involved 3 companies of the 2nd 13th attacking the initial defences at the Triangle and City from their high ground positions. This would be made on a 2-company front, with one acting as a close reserve. The second phase would be conducted by the 2nd 15th, which concentrated the whole battalion on Snell's Hill as a brigade reserve. Once the breakthrough had been made by the initial attack, the 2nd 15th would push through and clear the main defences at the plantation. Finally, 2 companies of the 2nd 17th would act as an exploitation force, moving through Finschhafen and clearing the coast to the south. This tempo of attack, with one battalion only moving on one objective, and then fresh forces moving through them and onto the next, is typical of a well-executed infantry assault. When a formation is engaged with the enemy, it can only attack so far before the impetus of its advance wanes. This is caused by the expenditure of ammunition, the increasing disorder of the subformations such as companies, the need to tend to the wounded, and the negative impact battle has upon morale. Indeed, the rotation of frontline units is key to modern infantry doctrine, a lesson hard won in the trenches of the Great War. The final attack was set for October the 1st, as it was felt that at least 2 days would be required to organise the battalions, bring forward ammunition, and reconnoitre the Japanese positions. At 7:30 am, the men left their start lines on the high ground to the north of the Triangle. The assaulting companies moved quickly towards the enemy. Their objective was scheduled to be hit with a medium bomber airstrike at 11 o'clock, which would then be followed by an artillery bombardment consisting of 30 rounds per gun. The infantry was ordered to be in position at 10:30 am. The aircraft arrived early, bombing and strafing the plantation at 10:35. This did virtually no damage to the well-entrenched Japanese. However, it did have the unintended effect of covering the battalion's approach. On the left flank, as Captain Deschamps' company moved towards its objective, it came under accurate fire from its left flank across the Elebe Creek. This had not been expected, and Deschamps decided it would be foolhardy to advance due south, leaving his left flank exposed to these Japanese elements. Thus, at the last possible moment, he completely changed the plan of attack, deciding to swing left and advance east into the plantation instead of south towards the Triangle and City. As Deschamps' company entered the cleared ground of the plantation, they came under heavy and accurate machine gun fire from a number of well-constructed positions. The men of 2 platoons took cover where they could, most going to ground in a dry creek bed. Deschamps withdrew his rear platoon and attempted to make contact with his forward elements via a flanking movement, but was again hindered by heavy and accurate fire. To their right, not knowing of Deschamps' decision to attack the plantation, Captain Cribb's company moved south towards their objective, the Triangle. As they advanced with 2 platoons in front and 1 in close reserve, the captain realised something was wrong when he began to receive fire from his left flank. He had expected Deschamps' company to be holding his left, but without realising the change in Australian dispositions, the whole company now found their flank hanging. The forward platoons were now in a crossfire and went to ground. They were pinned just in front of the main Japanese defences, less than 50 metres away. By 3 o'clock, with both companies pinned by heavy and accurate Japanese fire, which now included mortars, it appeared as though the attack was quickly becoming a disaster. If the lead elements were not able to move, they would be steadily destroyed by enemy mortar fire. Thus, swift action had to be taken if the forward elements were to be saved from annihilation. On the left, catastrophe was only averted by the bravery, initiative, and leadership of Lieutenant Crawford. As accurate Japanese mortar fire took its ever-increasing toll, it was clear that the men could not stay where they were, nor could they retreat across the open ground to their rear. The only way out of this dire situation was to close with the enemy and kill him. Thus, Crawford ordered his men to fix bayonets. At his order, a force of 5 sections would charge the Japanese positions to their front. The attack began when Crawford charged forward and hurled a grenade at the closest Japanese positions. Suddenly, before anyone else had moved, a young Private Rolfe, a 23-year-old shearer from Goulburn, New South Wales, climbed up the creek bed alone and silenced one of the most deadly Japanese machine gun positions with a close-range burst from his Bren gun. With this display of suicidal gallantry to spur them on, the company burst out of the creek bed and charged the Japanese entrenchments. On the left of the line, as Lieutenant Ryan's men charged, they ran into the teeth of Japanese Type 92 medium machine gun fire. 3 fell dead within moments, but they were able to advance to a good piece of cover from which they could bring accurate fire to bear on the Japanese gunners. In the centre, Crawford suicidally led the charge. At the head of about 50 men, he sprinted across the 40 metres of open ground between the creek bed and the Japanese trenches. The defenders opened up on him with every arm at their disposal, but the bold attack was too much. At the sight of glistening bayonets and Lee Enfields, some of the Japanese broke and ran, using the coconut palms as cover. One outpost stood its ground, and Crawford doubled back towards the sound of gunfire. Here, Lieutenant Angel's platoon was engaging a Japanese element concentrated in a number of small huts. Both Angels and Crawford were wounded in this final engagement, but continued to lead the attack. Leading his men into the confined quarters, Angels was set upon by a Japanese soldier who ambushed him from behind one of these huts. The 2 men wrestled one another along the wall, a fight to the death which would be fought with bare hands. Here, the wounded Angels was at a serious disadvantage. With the Japanese soldier gaining the upper hand, the desperate Angels was saved when one of his troopers intervened, killing the enemy with his bayonet. With the huts now cleared, one major Japanese position remained. Its fire was heavy and accurate, pinning Ryan's platoon as it approached. The mortar platoon soon showed their worth, however, suppressing the position with accurate 3-inch fire, allowing the infantry to close in. As the Australians drew close, these men too broke, fleeing into the plantation. Finally, the left flank of the battalion had been cleared. About 50 Japanese men had been killed, but the Australians had suffered heavy casualties, 6 killed and 21 wounded. The fact that Deschamps' company had to completely change its plan of attack and sweep left instead of advancing south was simply due to a failure of reconnaissance. The captain should have known his company would face heavy flanking fire from these positions, but they had not been detected prior to the attack. It was only the adaptability, initiative and bravery of the 2nd 13th Battalion that allowed the attack to succeed at all. As the fight around the Alebe Creek raged, Cribb's company struggled to take the triangle. Here the Japanese positions were established on a low cliff top and covered by thick undergrowth. This approach was deemed to be impossible, and thus Cribb decided to bypass this position and move to the right flank towards the city. He requested that a company of the 2nd 15th relieve Deschamps' men so the whole battalion could focus upon the main objective to the south, and by late afternoon the 2 companies were probing the Japanese left flank. As Deschamps' exhausted men moved around Cribb's right flank, they came upon a very strong defensive position at the Kakakog Ridge. Here the Japanese had entrenched medium machine guns with excellent fields of fire dominating the low ground before them. The Imperial Japanese Army was truly excellent in defense. Often stereotyped as just being fanatical fighters who would die at their post, the truth is the Japanese ability to use fortifications and the manner in which they emplaced their heavy weapons was exceptional all throughout the war. Here the 2nd 13th ran into a brick wall. All afternoon, Deschamps attacked this position, but to no avail. One such movement was conducted under the massed fire of the company's Bren guns, which were organised into a grand battery. The torrent of fire these weapons unleashed on the Japanese achieved nothing but drawing heavy Type 92 machine gun and mortar fire in response. As the Australians advanced, their casualties grew. By nightfall, every officer in Deschamps' company was wounded, including the captain himself. As the sun set, the 2nd 13th were forced to dig in. A day of ferocious fighting had brought them to within just 50 yards of their objectives, but they had not achieved them. For the loss of 10 killed and 70 wounded, the 2nd 13th Battalion had killed between 80 and 100 Japanese during the fight for Kakakog on the 1st of October. Windaya ordered the 2nd 15th Battalion to be ready to continue the attack in the morning. Although it seemed as though the 2nd 13th had failed, the ferocity of their attack and the fact that they had essentially outflanked the main Japanese positions had imposed a dire situation on the defending force. It was clear to the Japanese that they were going to be outflanked and destroyed, and contact had been made with another Australian battalion that was advancing along the coast to the south. Thus, with their flank turned and in danger of being trapped in a pincer, the Japanese abandoned Finschhafen. Quietly, they left their positions and took to the hills, bypassing the Australian outposts on Starvation Hill. Papuan reconnaissance elements had noted the steady movement of Japanese infantry from Finschhafen to Sattelberg over the previous 2 days, and by the night of the 1st of October, they retreated en masse. Evidence of the Japanese evacuation was first detected by the rapidly advancing 22nd Battalion. Its 30-kilometre overland march had been a slow one, but as it approached its objective, it rapidly gained ground. On the 1st of October alone, it advanced nearly 10 kilometres without encountering any resistance, securing Dregahama by nightfall. Early on the 2nd of October, the 2nd 17th Battalion crossed the Bumi River along the coast, where the Japanese defences had been most formidable and encountered scant opposition. By 9:30 am, they had cleared the whole Salankawa plantation. At the town of Finschhafen itself, the 2nd 13th Battalion approached the Japanese positions at the city and Kakakog Ridge. They advanced quietly and carefully, walking silently through the dense undergrowth. As they approached the ridge, the artillery forward observer dropped 3 25-pounder rounds on the Japanese positions, which drew no fire in response. Realizing the Japanese had fled, the 2nd 13th rapidly advanced. The battalion quickly entered the area called the city, in reality little more than a tropical village. All they found there was a lone Japanese defender sitting on the steps of a hut. The wounded man put up no resistance. He simply sat there, dejected, as the Australians approached. Imperial Marines and the spirit of samurai had taken advantage of the night and fled, wrote one Australian soldier. The 2nd 17th was no less rapid. By midday, it had cleared the port of Finschhafen, advancing all the way to Maniba Point. To the south, the militiamen of the 22nd Battalion had finally made contact with the 20th Brigade. They had advanced across nearly 40 kilometres of mountainous jungle, clearing the whole south coast of the Huon Peninsula in the process. Although all knew the battle was far from over, the 2nd of October provided a brief moment of pause. In the eye of the storm, the men were, really for the first time since they had landed on Scarlet Beach 11 days ago, allowed some rest and relaxation. One Australian soldier wrote in his diary, "Came evening, and we went down to Finschhafen by the sea. Here lay peace and primitive civilization, native pads avenued by hibiscus in bloom, stately palms almost regal in their look, flowering frangipani, island fruit in abundance. All were happy. We had done our job. Once more, the 20th had got through. Finschhafen had fallen, but it had not been at light cost. The 20th Brigade had suffered 358 casualties in just 11 days of fighting, some 20 officers and 338 men, of whom 8 officers and 65 men had been killed. Additionally, 6 officers and 295 men were evacuated from their units due to sickness, but some of these were back by the 2nd of October. As the fight for Finschhafen was drawing to a bloody close, the battle at Sattelberg was only growing more intense. The newly arrived 2nd 43rd Battalion had relieved the 2nd 17th on the 30th of September. In this area of the front, the Sattelberg Road ran directly inland from Scarlet Beach, climbing into the hills to the town of Sattelberg, about 5 kilometres inland. The initial advance to the 2nd 17th had been halted about halfway up the track at Jivevenang. As the 2nd 43rd had moved up, its lead company had relieved the 2 companies of the 2nd 17th who had been holding the area for several days. Captain Grant, the company CO, had arrived with 2 platoons. He had barely surveyed the situation when movement was heard along his forward perimeter. Facing Grant was Lieutenant Colonel Takagi's 3rd Battalion, 80th Regiment, which had unsuccessfully attacked down the Sattelberg Road on the 26th of September. The 2nd 43rd was strung out along the road, with Joshua's battalion headquarters several kilometres to the rear. It had been the Colonel's intention that additional units should move up to Jivevenang on the 2nd of October. However, in the morning, he lost telephone contact with Grant. The Japanese had flanked around their forward position and cut the road. Grant's company was cut off and surrounded. Grant had meagre resources under his command. 2 platoons of Australians, and 1 of Papuan Rifles. Unrivaled in scouting and intelligence gathering, the native men were exceptional reconnaissance troops, but they were not well suited to grim defence and an extended firefight. As the day's battle raged, increasing numbers of Papuans decided to take to the bush rather than face the Japanese. Grant had to disperse the remainder amongst his Australians in order to keep their morale up. The first attack came at dawn. The Japanese again began their assault with a loud cheer, which did little more than alert the defenders. It was quickly broken up by automatic fire. The Australian position may have been small and relatively easy to outflank, but it dominated a piece of clear ground which made for an excellent defensive position. As the Japanese left the cover of the jungle, they were savaged by rifle, Bren and Owen gunfire. By 9:20 am, a relief company was advancing up the road. It was about 500 metres away from Javevenang when the lead section came under accurate fire from Japanese positions to the right of the track, killing the lead platoon CO, Lieutenant Dost. All day, both Australian companies engaged in an almost constant firefight as the Japanese tried to both attack Javevenang and hold the road behind it. The Japanese blocking position on the Sattelberg road was a strong one, and Joshua decided that 2 companies were required to break through. By 5:20 p.m, 4 platoons attacked up the track along a 2-company front, but were halted by intense fire from high ground on the right flank. They dug in for the night. At Javevenang, Grant was becoming increasingly concerned by the lack of ammunition, and the men were ordered to only fire on observed targets. They had beaten back 5 attacks by nightfall, all of which had came from the same staging area. The company's casualties for the day were 12, including 2 killed. Despite their precarious position, cut off and surrounded as they were, spirits were high. When Captain Grant cautioned one of his soldiers to speak more quietly, the private replied, "It's all right, Skipper, they know where we are." Indeed, with so many contacts, the Japanese now had a very good picture of the Australian position, but with the terrain favouring the defender, there was not all that much they could do about it. Apart from a steady mortar bombardment, Grant's company held off the repeated attacks with relative ease. After a sleepless night, the next day brought no let-up into battle. At 11:30 am, the heavens opened and the men were drenched by a relentless tropical downpour. The rain was so heavy that the fighting positions in foxholes were literally filled to the brim with muddy water. At 1 p.m, the Japanese again attacked, opening up on the Australian position with all of the weapons at their disposal. As battle raged, for some 2 hours the rain was so heavy that it was difficult to hear where the fire was coming from, but the company held its positions. Further to the rear, the rest of the battalion were struggling to break the encirclement. Just as the Japanese were attacking Grant's company, Captain Richmond's men advanced towards the ferocious sound of battle further up the track. They too were greatly hampered by the rain. After an 80-yard advance in jungle and rain that was so thick it may as well have been a night assault, the attack faltered as the company came under withering fire from unseen Japanese positions, suffering 27 casualties in the process. The terrain here clearly favoured defence, as both sides were painfully discovering, and by the afternoon the relative positions had hardly changed. With the situation along the Sattelberg road steadily deteriorating, Windeyer hurried back north. Finschhafen had been taken just in time, but the operation had not been without serious risk. His main strength, the 3 battalions of the 20th Brigade, were all concentrated in the south. His base and communications at Scarlet Beach were only defended by a single infantry battalion and a number of supporting elements such as anti-aircraft artillery. It had been obvious from the opening phase of the operation that there were significant Japanese forces at Sattelberg, constantly menacing his right flank, and any Japanese reinforcements would arrive in this area. Although there were now 5 battalions under his command, these forces were strung out in a position that stretched for some 20 kilometers along the coast. With his forces dispersed so thinly, if the Japanese concentrated on a single point, they would most probably be able to achieve a decisive force ratio advantage, making a breakthrough all the more likely. Worse was the state of Windeyer's communications. The tracks and terrain made the rapid movement of forces from one position to another difficult, hindering his ability to react to any significant counterattack. Evidence was also mounting that the Japanese were concentrating their forces against the 20th Brigade. Aerial reconnaissance detected significant barge activity along the north coast of the Huon Peninsula. Unless significant and rapid action was taken to address the situation, the reinforced Japanese might well regain the initiative. But it was precisely at this time that resources were being diverted away from Finschhafen. On the 29th of September, New Guinea Force received a new set of operational instructions from MacArthur's GHQ. On the 10th of October, General Kinney's main bomber force, with necessary fighter escort, would be diverted to assist operations in the South Pacific. On the 1st of November, Admiral Carpenter's naval forces would be relieved of naval responsibility for sea transportation to Lae, and on the 15th of November to Finschhafen. And towards the end of November, both air and naval forces would again be diverted to support operations against Western New Britain. The only shipping assets that would be made available to the Australian First Corps would be the boat battalion of the 532nd Engineer Boat Shore Regiment and one boat company of the 542nd. This would be enough to move a few more battalions to Finschhafen, but would not be sufficient to sustain forces of a full division in strength. Always more comfortable when on the attack, MacArthur clearly had his eyes on the follow-on operations that would decisively exploit the Australian victory in New Guinea. But he was counting his chickens before they had hatched, assuming the battle was already won before the main strength of the Japanese 20th Division had even been engaged, despite repeated warnings from his Australian subordinates. But in his impatience, MacArthur was leaving the exposed Allied position at Finschhafen more and more vulnerable. On the 1st of October, Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead flew to Lae for a conference with the other Australian generals. One of the most famous and successful Australian generals of the war, Morshead, who had led the 9th Division throughout the North African campaign, including the defence of Tobruk, had spent the previous year in Australia. Nominally, he was the commander of the 2nd Australian Corps, which had been composed of the 6th, 7th and 9th Divisions, the headquarters of which were in the Atherton Tablelands in Queensland. However, in mid-1943, the 7th and 9th Divisions had been deployed to New Guinea as part of Operation Postern. With only elements of the 6th Division in Australia, Morshead was a corps commander without a corps. Finally, on the 23rd of September, Blamey had informed Morshead that he would receive an operational command against the Japanese. He was ordered to deploy his headquarters to New Guinea and assume command of the 5th, 7th and 9th Divisions, relieving General Herring's 1st Corps headquarters, which then possessed the main strength of the Australian Army in New Guinea. Just 1 week later, he was in Lae conferring with the other Australian generals. Although he did not know it at the time, this would be General Herring's last moments of operational command. A criminally unknown figure in Australian military history, the quiet and unassuming Edmund Herring was the guiding hand behind the Allies' most important victories in the Southwest Pacific. Often happy to stand in the shadow of his more famous superiors, Blamey and especially MacArthur, it was the cool, calm and professional Herring that actually implemented the often grandiose orders that came from GHQ. A team player, somewhat of a necessary trait given the colossal egos around him, Herring was more than happy to demur to his superstar superiors, both publicly and privately, subordinating himself in the interests of the army, nation and mission. He had assumed command of New Guinea Force at its lowest point, the retreat of Brigadier Potts's beleaguered brigade along the Kokoda track, and the unfortunate departure of General Rao. From that moment, Herring had calmly and professionally led the Allies to victory at Kokoda, Gorari, Gona, Buna, Salamaua, Lae and Finschhafen, always enabling rather than undermining his battlefield commanders, and playing an integral role in the formulation of the campaign plan that proved to be so successful in 1943. In doing so, he had spent over a year living rough in various forward headquarters across mountainous New Guinea. Herring's professionalism, dedication, competence, humility and cheery spirit had provided an unseen foundation to Allied victory in the crucial battles of 1942 and 1943. Surprisingly, and somewhat sadly for a general of his caliber, Herring would leave the military within the year. But by February 1944, he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria, a fitting post-war career for a man to whom the nation owed so much. Morshead met with Herring, Wooten, Milford and Mackay to discuss the ongoing battle at Finschhafen. Although the logistical assets placed at the Australians' disposal were meagre, at least they were unequivocally under New Guinea Forces command. The entire 1st Corps, nearly 5 divisions in strength, was only allocated 117 LCVPs, or Higgins boats, and 29 landing craft mechanized. Nonetheless, with the confusion surrounding the allocation of amphibious forces now resolved, the Australians could plan for the reinforcement of Finschhafen with confidence. Mooreshead decided that a radar station had to be established on the Tammy Islands in order to provide early warning of incoming air raids, and once it had been organised, the balance of the 24th Brigade would join the 2nd 43rd Battalion around Sattelberg, in addition to the 9th Division Headquarters and 2nd 3rd Pioneer Battalion, but it would probably be over a week before this movement could be conducted. At Finschhafen, Windeyer was rapidly redeploying his forces. The main force of the 20th Brigade was rapidly deployed to the right flank. The 2nd 17th Battalion occupied the centre of the Australian line to the left of the 2nd 43rd. Acting as a brigade reserve, the exhausted 2nd 13th Battalion was concentrated in a central position at Kakakong, to the rear of the 2nd 17th. The area of the town itself and its southern approaches was left to the 2nd 15th and 22nd Battalion. The 20th Brigade had been ordered to take Sattelberg as a prerequisite for follow-on operations towards Sio, but the Japanese were present in unexpected strength, and the positions along the Sattelberg road itself were extremely formidable. The Brigadier decided that an attack along the main road would not be propitious, to use his prose. In any case, he had been ordered by Wooten to keep the 2nd 43rd Battalion as disengaged as possible, as he wanted the 24th Brigade to be able to undertake offensive operations once it was concentrated. Thus, he decided upon a flank attack. About 3 kilometres to the south of the Sattelberg Road ran a parallel track which rose into the hills to the village of Kumawa. Ironically named Easy Street, this precipitous mountain track later intercepted another pathway that ran through the village of Sissi before meeting the Sattelberg Road behind Jivevenang. Thus, this little-known native track provided a potential axis of attack that could outflank the main Japanese defences on the Sattelberg Road. The 2nd 17th was ordered to advance inland along Easy Street and take the village of Kumawa. On the Sattelberg Road itself, the 2nd 43rd was ordered to hold its positions. Grant's encircled company would be relieved if possible, but if the rest of the battalion could not break through, then Joshua was given permission to pull Grant's men back to the main line, a distance of about 400 metres. By the 3rd of October, things were quietening down around Jivevenang. That day, the Japanese made no attacks on Grant's beleaguered company. Colonel Joshua sent a platoon-sized patrol to try and break through, but could not reach them. With no radio communication, Grant was relying on Papuan runners to communicate with Battalion HQ, which, despite the bravery of the Papuan soldiers, was unreliable to say the least. At 11:30, the colonel decided to pull his men back, as holding Jivevenang was more trouble than it was worth. When Grant received orders by a runner, he had already decided to withdraw. The understrength company had been isolated and surrounded for 3 days, and had spent the majority of the prior 2 fighting off determined Japanese attacks. He was low on ammunition, and without supply, there was little point remaining where he was. However, just as the company was about to leave, the ground around Jivevenang was drenched in high explosive. With a rolling artillery bombardment pounding the surrounding jungle, the men quickly retreated to the safety of their foxholes. As they watched, artillery flattened the jungle around them, revealing its origin. The concentrated brigade artillery was hitting the suspected Japanese positions with hundreds of 25-pounder rounds, in addition to heavy mortar fire. After the order to withdraw had been issued, Windeyer visited the 2nd 43rd Battalion HQ. In a conference with Colonel Joshua, Windeyer outlined the new campaign plan. The 2nd 17th was to make the main effort up Easy Street. The 2nd 43rd was ordered to launch a supporting attack along the Sattelberg Road, with the 2 objectives of relieving Grant's company and fixing the Japanese forces on this flank. The supporting artillery bombardment and attack up the track not only pinned the Japanese in place, it prevented Grant from withdrawing. By late afternoon, another company attack was made along the main road. This one, too, went to ground in the face of well-emplaced machine guns. The Japanese had arranged their defences expertly, enfilading the main track in a crossfire, and the steepness of the surrounding terrain prevented easy flanking movements. Since its arrival, the 2nd 43rd Battalion had lost 47, including 14 killed and 5 missing, and had precious little to show for it. Grant was ordered to hold his ground, and, miraculously, given his desperate supply situation, the Japanese did not attack his position for the rest of the day. As the battle around Jivevenang raged, trouble began on the far right of the Australian line. The coastal track leading to the north of Scarlet Beach had been regularly patrolled since the landing. However, no enemy activity had been detected in this sector throughout the battle. On the 3rd of October, this track was held by a single platoon of the 2nd 43rd Battalion's Anti-Tank Gun Company, fighting here as infantry. At 7:15 am, a single Japanese scout was seen walking nonchalantly down the track some 450 metres north of the Song River. The unsuspecting man was shot and killed by the OP, but during the next 4 hours, the platoon fought off 3 attacks, each in platoon strength. These forces were the lead elements of Lieutenant Colonel Shobu's 2nd Battalion of the 80th Regiment, which had recently been deployed on the Mongi River. On the 28th of September, Colonel Miyake of the 80th Regiment had ordered that the Shobu Battalion is to seek out and attack the enemy who is advancing in our direction from the Song River. This new threat illustrated just how thinly spread the Australian line was. If the enemy broke through on the northern front, they could take Scarlet Beach, the logistical heart of the 20th Brigade. The loss of the beach would mean the loss of the battle. Windea was thoroughly alarmed by these events, but had no forces available to meet the new threat. The 2nd 13th was simply too far away at Kakakong. The only formation close enough to react was a single company of pioneers, combat engineers, that were engaged in work around the beachhead. Even before orders were received from brigade headquarters, Major Broadbent, worried by the proximity of Japanese elements to Scarlet Beach, immediately dispatched Major P.E. Siekman's company of the 2nd 3rd Pioneers to reinforce Captain Nicholas's company of the 2nd Machine Gun Battalion and the elements of the 2nd 43rd west of the mouth of the Song. That afternoon, the pioneers immediately counterattacked the Japanese positions, gaining some ground before coming under enfilading fire from flanking high ground. Windea had to reinforce his right flank, but he had no forces immediately available. The brigade reserve was concentrated at Kakakong, several miles to the south, and the 2nd, 15th and 22nd Battalions were even farther away. Such was the nature of the Australian position, stretched out as it was along the coast. The only free force was the 2nd 17th, which was currently advancing up Easy Street, but Windea was unwilling to abandon this flanking movement, especially as the Easy Street junction not only outflanked the Japanese positions at Jivevenang, it was perfectly positioned to intercept Japanese units that were still fleeing Finschhafen. Thus, Windea decided upon an unconventional solution. He would split the 2nd 17th Battalion. He would form 2 half-strength ad hoc battalions, each based on 2 of the battalion's 4 rifle companies, supported by its other various elements. This new battalion was formed under the headquarters of Major McClan, the commander of the headquarters company. By last light, McClan's force had reached the pioneers along the Song. They had marched all the way back down Easy Street to get there. The fact that Windea had to split one of his line battalions shows just how thinly stretched the Australian position around Finschhafen was, and how badly Windea needed reinforcement. In reality, the only thing saving the Australians from disaster was the difficulty Adachi was having in moving the 20th Division forward. As the sun rose on the 4th of October, Captain Grant was still holding his positions at Jivevenang. At dawn, Sergeant Scott Holland, an engine driver from St. Lucia, Queensland, along with 2 Papuan riflemen, arrived at Grant's position. Scott Holland had used the cover of darkness to slip between the various Japanese outposts along the track, dodging an enemy patrol in the process. He found Grant and his men exhausted but in good spirits. Scott Holland carried orders from Colonel Joshua to again attempt a breakout. At 9:15, these instructions were again repeated to Grant as Australian boomerangs of No. 4 Squadron dropped ammunition and written orders on his position. By midday, they were on their way. Led by Sergeant Scott Holland, carrying their many wounded, Grant's Australians and Papuans silently walked through the thick jungle. Strangely, they were able to advance unmolested, and by 1 p.m. they met a friendly patrol. 2 hours later, the exhausted men of Grant's company were finally back at Battalion HQ. Throughout the 4 days of their encirclement, the defenders had suffered 12 casualties, including 2 killed in action, but Grant estimated that at least 50 enemy had been killed. They had performed exceptionally well. Subjected to countless attacks and a nearly constant mortar bombardment, they inflicted such a heavy toll on the enemy that by the 3rd, the Japanese had given up on trying to destroy them. In fact, Japanese losses had been so severe that they actually abandoned Jbebenang on the 4th. At the right flank on the Song River, the scratch Australian force was attempting to drive back the Shobu battalion from its menacing position. After the initial engagement, the Japanese had withdrawn about a kilometre up the track, and no contact had been made since. 2 platoons of pioneers carefully advanced on either side of the track, and by midday had met several Japanese elements, driving them back after a number of skirmishes. By midday, they had reached the primary Japanese positions, which were revealed by a heavy firefight. These 2 positions were eventually flanked by a company of the 2nd 17th, moving around the right flank high ground to North Hill. They found the Japanese positions unoccupied. Rather than the undefended avenue of attack they expected, the quick Australian reaction and counterattack had convinced the Japanese to withdraw. With the threat to the right flank now countered, Windeyer decided to reimpose order on his brigade. The 2nd 43rd Battalion had elements on the Sattelberg Road and Song River, and the 2nd 17th had 2 companies on the Easy Street Junction and McLaren's force near Scarlet Beach. McLaren was ordered to relieve the 2nd 43rd Battalion on the Sattelberg Road. This force would then concentrate on the northern front, which had been extended several kilometres over the Song River. The rapid dissection of the 2nd 17th Battalion had averted disaster on the right flank, but it had left the position around Kumawa at the Easy Street Junction dangerously exposed. There were just 2 rifle companies on the Easy Street front, which were dispersed over a reasonably large area. In fact, the critical track junction at Kumawa was only held by 2 rifle platoons. The Australian possession of this location was a dire positional threat to the Japanese, as it menaced the flank of the Sattelberg Road defences and isolated the elements that were retreating from the south. The Japanese threw everything they had at Kumawa, hitting it with infantry assaults from the south, north and west. The company was deployed for 360-degree defence, and again an Australian element was in danger of encirclement. This time it was Captain Dinning's company that had to endure the onslaught, facing a simultaneous attack that was several companies in strength. But again, the cool temperament of the men, their disciplined rifle fire, and the firepower of their automatic weapons easily broke up these assaults. Rather than attacking towards Sisi as they had been ordered, the half of the 2nd 17th Battalion that had been holding Kumawa was doing all they could to simply survive. However, reinforcements were on the way. Although it had taken several days to achieve, the whole brigade had been redeployed to the north of Finschhafen. The 2nd 15th Battalion, which had been deployed to the south of Finschhafen Harbour, were rapidly marching towards Kumawa. The pioneers had been struggling to turn Easy Street into a jeep track, but the terrain was so steep and the rain so tumultuous that they struggled to do so. Nonetheless, by the 8th of October, the vanguard of the 2nd 15th Battalion had arrived at Kumawa, and the Australian position on Easy Street was far more firmly held. Windeyer had again decided that the main offensive task should fall to his brigade, with 2 battalions arranged in the central sector on the Sattelberg Road and Easy Street. With the Japanese forces now concentrating more and more in the northern sector, the Australian left flank could be thinned. Finschhafen itself was now held by the 2nd 13th alone, and the 22nd Battalion held a very large area, centred on Dregger Harbour. At Jbebenang, McLaren's element of the 2nd 17th Battalion decided to assault the high ground positions to the left of the road, called the Knoll. Led by Papuan scouts, who were proving to be absolutely critical to Australian operations, Captain Sheldon's company advanced quietly through the jungle. They eventually reached a position about 50 metres from the Japanese high ground positions. Strangely, the Japanese were not using observation posts, and a platoon was able to reach this position undetected. Under the cover of a quarter-hour-long artillery bombardment, the men crept closer. Eventually, Lieutenant Benny's men got to within just 10 paces of the Japanese positions, hidden as they were by the thick undergrowth. On Benny's order, the platoon opened up on the unsuspecting Japanese. At this range, it was literally a firing squad. The lack of security and reconnaissance had cost the Japanese dearly. With an Australian infantry element so close, they had no chance of stopping the attack. Behind a cacophony of Bren and Owen gun fire, the 3 platoons charged through the small clearing towards the primary Japanese positions. Several fighting positions fell before the remaining Japanese fled, and by 1 PM, Sheldon's company were digging in on the high ground, where they found about 60 Japanese fighting positions. 9 Japanese bodies were found, and Sheldon had only suffered 4 casualties, all wounded. The Japanese were stung by this reverse. They had lost a dominating terrain feature to a surprise Australian attack, one made possible by their own incompetence, a setback they immediately attempted to reverse. Within an hour, a Japanese company had formed up in the low ground to the north. Preceded by the typical bugle call and chants, which had no impact on their enemies, and a mortar bombardment that did, they attacked vigorously. This assault was hard pressed, and the most forward elements came within 5 meters before they fell back. Here the defenders were aided by the Japanese entrenchments, which were well constructed and sighted, and the steepness of the terrain. They were able to roll grenades down the hill, which imposed devastating casualties on the attackers. The Japanese should have been able to hold this position against a single infantry company, but the improper application of basic infantry doctrine, such as the use of observation posts, had allowed Sheldon's men to take it cheaply. They tried again to retake the knoll at last light, this time without the usual pageantry and bugle calls, but were again met by withering automatic fire and dogged resistance. By the 10th of October, the conditions were finally ready for the deployment of the 9th Division headquarters to Finschhafen. Along with the 24th Brigade HQ, Major General Wooten's headquarters staff boarded a number of Higgins boats and made the 10-hour journey to Dregger Harbour. He arrived just after midnight. For 3 weeks, Brigadier Windaya had led the 20th Brigade in ceaseless battle with his Japanese opponent, capturing Finschhafen in the process. Despite tenuous lines of supply, limited support, both in terms of air power and artillery ammunition, and lacking a force ratio advantage, Windaya had constantly attacked, wrenching the initiative away from the Japanese and refusing to allow them to effectively recover. In the words of the Australian official history, the courage and tenacity of the men of the 20th Brigade from 22nd of September had been matched by the skill and determination of their leader. As a whole, the brigade had lost 82 officers and men killed or missing and 276 wounded. Wooten approved of the Australian dispositions as he found them, effectively formalising the brigade formations as they were. Sattelberg was the 9th Division's immediate objective, as capturing that high ground was a prerequisite for any advance to Sio. Subsequently, capturing the Warreo track, which was the main ground line of communication between Sattelberg and Sio, would not only isolate the Japanese left flank positions, but allow for exploitation to the north. Thus, the 2 brigades were given these 2 objectives. The 24th Brigade, currently consisting only of the 2nd 43rd Battalion and 2nd 3rd Pioneers, would be responsible for operations to the north of the Song River. 24th Brigade was also ordered to defend the Scarlet Beach area in depth and gain control of the Bongao track junctions to the north. The area between the Sattelberg Road and Marpe River was the 20th Brigade's area of responsibility. This included the Jivevenang, Kumawa and Easy Street positions. 20th Brigade's objective was the capture of Sattelberg. Lastly, the 22nd Battalion would maintain its positions around Dregger Harbour, guarding the division's rear. Finally, on the 12th, the different battalions of the 20th Brigade were fully reconstituted. The whole 2nd 15th Battalion was now in possession of Kumawa, and by the use of a newly discovered overland route from Easy Street to Jivevenang, the 2nd 17th was once again whole, with the battalion now concentrated on the Sattelberg Road. In the Easy Street sector, the Australians again attacked. Captain Angus's company of the 2nd 15th Battalion assaulted a formidable Japanese high ground position to the west of Kumawa. As they began their attack, Angus's men came under withering medium machine gun fire from positions about 150 metres from their start line. As the men advanced into the teeth of this fire, a fierce battle developed. For a quarter of an hour, the 2 elements unloaded on one another with heavy rifle and automatic fire. Private Woods, a stockman from Nambour, Queensland, was in command of one section when the attack began. As he moved into the cleared ground before the Japanese positions, his section was decimated by enemy machine gun fire, which opened up at just 30 metres range. 2 men were instantly killed and 4 wounded, leaving only himself and 1 other still fighting. Nonetheless, Woods continued the attack, alone, charging the first machine gun position, spraying it with submachine gun fire and grenades, killing the enemy gunners. With this gun dealt with, Woods spotted another enemy position about 20 metres away. He charged this position as well, again alone, killing the enemy with his own gun. In fact, Woods was a rifleman, but he had discarded his SMLE and picked up an Owen gun from one of the wounded, a weapon he much preferred. With the fire of these positions now abating, the rest of the platoon was able to advance, achieving its objective. In this half-hour-long, lone firefight, Woods had expended 12 grenades and 15 Owen gun magazines, gathering additional ammunition from fallen comrades as he attacked. Private Woods survived the war, and received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions at Kumawa. Despite the formidable defensive position they held, the Japanese were not able to withstand the determination of the 9th Division, a fighting spirit embodied by men like Woods. With 39 men killed, they fled. In this engagement, the Australians suffered 30 casualties, with 5 dead. The loss of this feature hit the men of the 3rd Battalion, 80th Regiment hard. A diary of a Japanese soldier wrote of the engagement. "Enemy is now closing on our position. With tears in our eyes, we had to withdraw. Muddy roads, steep mountain trails. The trench, which is the safest place, is filled with water." Japanese operational security was exceptionally poor. Most Japanese men wrote in a diary, and after every battle, Australian intelligence staff were learning more and more about their enemy through their own words. Full of optimism and confidence in 1942, captured diaries in late 1943 were far more negative, full of despair at their situation, frustration at the limitations of Japanese arms, and vitriolic hatred for their enemies. This lack of operational security also extended to Japanese prisoners. Individual Japanese soldiers were not trained to withstand interrogation, or even given instructions as to what to do if captured. The Japanese High Command refused to believe that soldiers of Japan could be taken prisoner. They were simply ordered to keep one last grenade for themselves to avoid disgracing the Emperor and falling into the hands of the barbaric Australians and Americans. Fully expecting a gruesome death by torture, many Japanese prisoners were surprised at the fair treatment they received. With a cigarette in hand and a belly full of food, many were all too happy to share information with the friendly Australian interpreter. But the worst failing of Japanese operational security was the tendency of officers to operate in the forward area carrying detailed operational orders, maps, and documents. Almost as a rule, in the wake of a battle, Allied intelligence staff would be in the possession of detailed orders. This contrasted sharply with the Australians, who took operational security very seriously. As an example, on several occasions during the battle, secret documents at battalion and company headquarters were destroyed when these formations were under attack. Both of these Japanese weaknesses manifested around Finschhafen. On the 15th of October, a patrol from the 2nd 28th Battalion, which had just landed, captured a slightly wounded Japanese soldier, who quickly informed them that he was a corporal of the 1st Battalion, 238th Regiment, 41st Division, elements of which had deployed from Wewak to Finschhafen in September. As the patrol advanced, it skirmished with a Japanese element moving down the track, forcing the enemy to withdraw. Amongst the dead was a Japanese officer who, for some unknown reason, was carrying a detailed operational order issued on the 12th of October by Lieutenant General Shigeru Katagiri, the acting commander of the 20th Japanese Division. This not only detailed Japanese dispositions in the area, but their intentions. Allied intelligence, especially MacArthur's GHQ, had consistently underestimated Japanese strength in the eastern Huon Peninsula. They had reasoned that, with the loss of Leh, the utility of Finschhafen had been obviated, and thus the Japanese were unlikely to expend significant forces in its defence. They had maintained this belief in spite of the evidence Windeye's men had found, both in the strength of Japanese resistance, which MacArthur's staff had continued to believe was nothing more than an Australian exaggeration, and the flood of intelligence material. The reality was that when the 20th Brigade landed at Scarlet Beach, there were elements of all three divisions which comprised the 18th Japanese Army at Finschhafen, a force of over 5,000 men. Under the command of Major General Izo Yamada, 2 battalions of Colonel Miyake's 80th Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the 26th Field Artillery Regiment, the 7th Naval Base Force and other subunits, a grand total of about 3,200 troops, left Madang on the 23rd of August and arrived at Finschhafen on the 15th of September, one day before the fall of Leh. These supplemented the approximately 1,000 troops already there, who were also reinforced by a formation of 1,000 men who marched overland from Leh. Thus, rather than facing minimal resistance, the 20th Brigade would have to engage forces approximately equal to its own strength, a long way from the 3-to-1 advantage typically recommended for contested amphibious operations. Even before the landing at Scarlet Beach, arrangements had been made to move very significant Japanese forces to Finschhafen. With the remnant of the 51st Division little more than a column of walking wounded, including what remained of the 1st Battalion of the 80th Regiment and the 238th Regiment, now retreating over the Sarawagad Range to the north coast, little could be expected of these forces. The responsibility fell to General Katagiri's 20th Division, the main body of which left Madang on the 15th of September. Along with the whole 79th Regiment, which had a strength of some 3,196 men, Katagiri began advancing by both land and sea towards Finschhafen. When he arrived, the 20th Division headquarters would command the 79th and 80th Regiments and a further formation of regimental strength composed of a hodgepodge of other units. Essentially a full division, a force approximately 3 times the strength of the 20th Brigade. As these very formidable Japanese forces were converging on Finschhafen by land and sea, fully 2/3 of the 9th Division was sitting idle around Leh, playing cards and smoking cigarettes, stranded by a lack of transportation. When General Adachi learned of the landing at Scarlet Beach, he ordered the 80th Regiment to concentrate at Sattelberg and hold it until the arrival of the 20th Division's main body, which would allow for a large-scale counterattack. This explains the Australians' inability to advance beyond Jbevanang. Sattelberg was strongly held by the 80th Regiment. When news of the Finschhafen battle reached General Katagiri, he hastened his advance. He had originally planned to arrive in the Finschhafen area by the 25th of October, but realizing the gravity of the situation, the Japanese men pressed on as fast as they physically could. By the 10th, Katagiri was at Sattelberg with a portion of his forces. The 79th Regiment, along with the headquarters of the 26th Field Artillery Regiment and its 1st Battalion, had moved to Sio by barge and then marched overland. They were transported by the 5th Shipping Engineer Regiment and later the 9th Shipping Engineer Regiment. Although their infantry strength was formidable, the lack of appropriate barges meant Katagiri's force could only bring 6 75mm mountain guns. As the 79th Regiment advanced over the inland route from Sio, they encountered the survivors of Salamaua and Leh, the starving remnants of the 51st Division. These men were little more than walking ghosts, exhausted and broken by both battle and the mountains. They were in such a poor state that they could not be brought to Finschhafen, and the men of the 79th could not even spare rations for them. Eventually, the remnant of the 51st reached the coast around Sio and took up defensive positions guarding the rear of the 20th Division. By serendipity, both General Wooten and General Katagiri had arrived in the battle area within 24 hours of each other, an indication of just how close run a thing the Battle of Finschhafen had become. Any further delay in moving the 24th Brigade forward would have brought almost certain defeat and disaster, a calamity not seen in the Australian Army since Singapore. A day after Wooten outlined his plan for an offensive towards Sattelberg, General Katagiri issued his orders for the decisive battle. After dusk on October, the main strength of the 79th Infantry Regiment will attack the enemy in Ardent Point area from the north side. The assault boat Butai will penetrate through the coast north of Ardent Point on the night of X Day. Katagiri's plan of attack contained 3 major phases. The first would be conducted on the Japanese left flank. The 2nd Battalion of the 26th Artillery Regiment, fighting as infantry, along with 2 companies of the 1st Battalion of the 79th Regiment, would attack the Australian forces in the northern sector around Bonga. This would primarily act as a diversion. The second phase would be a nighttime amphibious assault. A seaborne attack by the 10th Company of the 79th Regiment, which had been left behind at Nambariwa, supported by a detachment of the 20th Engineer Regiment with explosives and demolition charges. This would take place on the night of X Day. Instructions to this boat penetration tie were that ammunition dumps, artillery positions, tanks, enemy HQ, moored boats, barracks, etc. should be selected as objectives. Thirdly, the main effort was to be made by the balance of the 80th and 79th Regiments. The whole 80th Regiment would attack down the Sattelberg Road towards Scarlet Beach and the artillery positions, which would be supported by the balance of the 79th Regiment, which would attack the northern sector and approach Katika from the northwest. X Day, stated Katagiri's order, will be decided on X-1 day at 2200 hours, and a fire will be seen for 20 minutes on the Sattelberg Heights. When the fire is seen, answer back at a suitable spot by fires. Even before this order was captured, Wooten had made preparations to fight a defensive battle, as other intelligence, including a warning from New Guinea Force intelligence staff, had indicated the possibility of a large-scale Japanese counterattack. At a conference with his senior officers on the 15th, Wootton decided to redeploy his forces for defence. Thinking the main attack would come in the southern sector, Windeyer was ordered to organise beach defences and defend in depth, maintain a mobile reserve, and hold important ground at all costs. Important areas to be defended included the track junctions in the Bonga area, North Hill, the high ground about 2 miles west of Scarlet Beach between the Song and Jivevenang, Kumara, Tirimoro, Butaweng, Longaweng, and the 532nd ESBR base at Dregger Harbour. By the 15th of October, Wootton had the bulk of 2 brigades under his command. The depleted 20th was in possession of the vital central sector, and the reasonably fresh 24th deployed in the north. When it arrived on the 15th, the 2nd 32nd Battalion, along with the 2nd Machine Gun Battalion, was designated as the Division Reserve and placed under Wootton's command. When Katagiri's order was translated and handed to Wootton, only minor amendments to the Australian dispositions were deemed necessary. He ordered Brigadier Evans, the 24th Brigade CO, to sight and hold at all costs a post north of River Song on direct track running through 620700 to Warreo, which track possible axis of enemy land attack. Wootton now had 8 battalions to meet the coming maelstrom, 6 of which were concentrated to the north of Finschhafen. But the main blow, when it came, would land on just 2. It would be up to these 2, or 3, battalions to bear the brunt of the largest Japanese offensive seen in the southwest Pacific area since Kokoda. Even before the Australian officers had been made aware of General Katagiri's captured orders, it was becoming obvious where the main thrust of their attack was. On the 15th of October, fierce fighting erupted along the Sattelberg road. Luckily for Windeyer, he had been given time to reorder his battalions. All 4 companies of the 2nd 17th Battalion were concentrated at Jivevenang, with 2 deployed on the left and right flank high ground, including the knoll, and the other 2 arranged on either side of the track. No stranger to the dangers and challenges of battle, the 16th would be another day of relentless combat for the veterans of the 2nd and 17th. At 4:45 am, the observation posts, manned by the invaluable Papuan rifles, fell back after engaging a Japanese element in the darkness. Despite the noise of battle alerting the battalion, a Japanese element was still able to move undetected between the company positions, using the thick jungle as cover. Moving behind the forward positions, the lead elements crept to within 50 metres of the battalion headquarters. At first light, they initiated a fierce attack, which was beaten back by Major Madam's headquarters company and the headquarters staff. At 7:30, the forward positions along the track were subjected to a heavy and accurate artillery bombardment, after which 4 separate attacks were made against the battalion's positions. As ever, the 2nd 17th was steadfast in defence, beating back all of these assaults, but the men's nerves were tested by the day-long firefight and constant artillery and mortar bombardment. The battalion suffered 19 casualties, with 5 killed in action. This was probably a reconnaissance in force, roughly a battalion in strength, designed to give the 80th Regiment a better understanding of the Australian positions. Although there was no other significant fighting on the 16th on other areas of front, evidence of the approaching Japanese division was everywhere. In the northern sector, 3 companies of the 2nd 3rd Pioneer Battalion were holding high ground positions to the north of the Song River, just inland of Scarlet Beach. All day, the forward platoon clashed with Japanese elements moving east. Brigadier Evans was concerned that the Japanese might be infiltrating between these widely dispersed companies. "You must patrol vigorously," Brigadier Evans ordered Colonel Galash of the Pioneers, "to prevent enemy getting in close in force." In fact, the 79th Regiment had already infiltrated these positions and was preparing an attack farther east, near the coast. Wootton believed that the 16th of October was X-1 day, and he ordered his men to keep an eye out for the signal fire on Sattelberg Heights. It rained heavily that night, and many supposed that it would be impossible to even light a large signal fire in conditions like that. Nonetheless, at 8:30 p.m, a company of the 22nd Battalion reported seeing a large fire on top of Sattelberg Height, and its war diary records that this was reported to Division Headquarters. However, no report reached Wootton. Despite the miscommunication, the defenders were ready. At 3:15 am, the Finschhafen area was hit with a heavy air raid. Some 66 bombs landed amongst the Australian positions, but did no damage. In fact, this bombardment did nothing more than alert the defenders. Half an hour later, a coast watcher stationed a few kilometres north detected movement. 3 barges heading south along the coast. The seaborne attack was imminent, and orders were rapidly passed to the 2nd 43rd Battalion to prepare for action. These Japanese barges were manned by men of the 10th Company of the 79th Regiment, and picked platoons from the 20th Engineer Regiment and the 5th Shipping Engineer Regiment. General Adachi himself described their mission. The above units, having received orders to prepare to attack the enemy's rear by boat in connection with the division's operations to annihilate the force which has landed north of Finschhafen, undertook intensive training for about 20 days under the command of Company Commander 1st Lieutenant Sugino at Nambariwa Base. The men all awaited the appointed day, firm in their belief of certain victory. On 16th of October 1943, at the time of the attack by the division's main strength to annihilate the enemy north of Katika, the unit received orders to penetrate the shore south of the mouth of the Song River. After drinking the sake graciously presented to the divisional commander by the Emperor, the unit vowed anew its determination to do or die, and departed from the base boldly at dusk on the same day. Repulsing the interference of enemy PT boats on the way, the unit arrived at the designated point at 0230 hours on the 17th. What General Adachi glossed over in his description of the Sugino detachment's actions was the fact that this element was devastated by American PT boats as it moved to Finschhafen. Reportedly, 4 barges were sunk in a night action as they approached the beachhead, which would mean fully half of Sugino's force was annihilated en route. As the 3 barges rounded the point, they made a hard right turn towards their objective, approaching the far right of the beach, near the mouth of the Song River. This area was heavily fortified, and poor Japanese operational security had robbed them of the surprise Sugino so desperately needed. In fact, the Allies were ready and waiting for them. This area of the beach was held by a mixed force of Americans and Australians. The main force holding the beach as a whole was 2 companies of the 2nd 28th Battalion, an element of the 10th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery, with one 40mm Bofors gun, and an element of the 2nd 28th Anti-Tank Gun Platoon with a pair of 2-pounder guns. The northern beach defences were manned by Captain Kopek's company. These were supplemented by a detachment from the 352nd ESBR, which provided a single M2 50 caliber heavy machine gun and a 37mm anti-tank gun. Between these heavy weapons, infantry manned a trench network and a number of fighting positions. The barges approached a section of beach right beneath the Bofors and M2 position. They were immediately fired upon by the Bofors crew and the 37mm gun, but in the darkness, neither were able to score any hits. With the range now so close, the Bofors crew could not depress their gun low enough, and the men were ordered into the trenches to face the oncoming enemy. As the first 2 barges hit the beach, Japanese infantry rushed ashore straight into the teeth of an intense firefight. The defending infantry and a single Bren gun opened up on them with all of the arms at their disposal, but in the pitch darkness, identifying and hitting targets was difficult. Right next to the Bofors position was the M2 heavy machine gun. This position was just 15 metres inland, and one of the barges had landed directly to its front. The weapon was manned by a 19-year-old Private Nathan Van Noy, Jr. from Grace, Idaho, and his loader, Corporal Stephen Popper. As the din of battle erupted all around him, Van Noy calmly held his fire until the Japanese, led by a bugler and 2 flamethrowers, were within feet of his camouflaged gun. As the Japanese infantry charged up the beach, they blindly threw grenades in front of them. One luckily landed right in Van Noy's weapon pit. The explosion shattered his leg and badly wounded Corporal Popper, who immediately withdrew. Rather than retreat, Van Noy opened up with a devastating weight of fire, cutting down those to his front and immediately pinning the rest of the force. The Japanese were still departing the barge directly to his front when Van Noy opened fire. The close-range 50 caliber fire caused absolute carnage aboard the tightly packed barge, soon nothing more than a smouldering wreck filled with dismembered corpses. As the lead Japanese elements were now pinned just 5 meters from the beach defenses, and neither side could see one another in the darkness, the battle soon became a grenade duel. Despite calls to withdraw, Van Noy continued to rain utter destruction on the Japanese until another grenade landed beside him. Private Van Noy was killed at his weapon, his thumb still on the trigger, his ammunition almost exhausted. After witnessing the death of his friend, Corporal Popper looked up to see the glistening bayonet of a Japanese soldier. Facing imminent death, Popper shot the man in the head with his M1 Garand. He was later found alive, but unconscious, pinned beneath the body of the fallen Japanese. Yet again, as the generals bickered, young Australian and American men stood shoulder to shoulder in the same trench, facing down the same formidable enemy, fighting and falling alongside one another. There is no greater symbol of the Trans-Pacific Alliance than shared danger and sacrifice, and that was again on display in the dark Battle of Scarlet Beach. Private Nathan Van Noy, Jr. was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions on the 17th of October, 1943. Even with Van Noy's heavy machine guns silenced, the Japanese were now in a precarious position. They were still pinned by the Australian and American infantry to their front, hiding behind a low shelf at the water's edge, suffering mounting casualties from grenades. About 150 metres along the beach, the 2nd 28th's anti-tank gun crews were now in a perfect enfilading position. Within minutes, the two barges had been knocked out by anti-tank gun fire. The third barge was still approaching the beach when the gunners opened up on it. Again, because the guns were farther south, they were presented with a broadside target. The barge was hit by a number of 2-pounder shells. This fire caused carnage amongst the closely packed men. The 1 kilogram, 40mm shell tearing through the occupants at over 2,500 feet per second, taking lives and limbs with it. Reeling from this devastating fire, the barge immediately turned and headed back to sea, the loud screams of the Japanese wounded clearly audible to the beach defenders. Although its fate is unknown, a number of Japanese bodies washed ashore to the north of the Song River, implying that the vessel soon sank. As the battle continued to rage, the Japanese position was being made all the more vulnerable by the steadily improving light. About 60 Japanese were thought to be pinned in front of the Allied beach defences. These were directly opposed by a handful of Australian and American defenders, less than a platoon in strength. The Australians immediately counterattacked. At first light, Lieutenant Kavanagh led his platoon of the 2nd 28th Battalion north along the beach, rolling up the Japanese position from the left. This decided the issue. The remaining Japanese, about 30 strong, withdrew to the north, wading across the Song River and disappearing into the jungle. This force was observed by a coast watcher. It was later intercepted by a patrol of the 2nd 43rd, which killed 26. Of the force that landed on Scarlet Beach, only 4 men escaped. At the water's edge itself lay 36 dead Japanese men, about half of whom met their fate at the hands of Private Van Noy. Behind them were 2 utterly destroyed barges. The seaborne attack had been catastrophically defeated, all by a mere handful of engineers and infantry. Allied casualties for the engagement were 1 killed and 4 wounded. This is, however, how General Adachi reported the action. Defying fierce artillery crossfire, the troops landed from the boats immediately. Taking up positions indicated beforehand, the 3 platoons advanced in columns in different directions. The infantry and engineers advanced as one body, creeping through the jungle. They annihilated the panic-stricken enemy everywhere and achieved glorious and distinguished success. They killed more than 430 of the enemy, destroyed 7 anti-aircraft guns, 5 machine cannons and machine guns, and 5 ammunition and supply dumps. Moreover, they blew up the enemy headquarters and bivouac tents, thus destroying his centre of command. These were in fact tents of the casualty clearing station. Raiding the area at will and with a raging fury, they surprised and overwhelmed the enemy. By disrupting his command organisation, they established the foundation for the victory of the division's main strength. With the company commander as the nucleus, the entire group put forth a united effort and demonstrated the unique and peerless spiritual superiority of the Imperial Army. All those who fell severely wounded committed suicide by using hand grenades, and, of the total of 186 men, all except 58 became guardian spirits of their country. The actual reality was, of course, that the attack had been emphatically defeated, had achieved nothing, and Sugino Detachment had been utterly and pointlessly destroyed. In the high ground above Scarlet Beach, the 4 companies of the 2nd 3rd Pioneer Battalion could hear the noise of battle to their rear. But before Colonel Galash could send a runner to inquire about the fate of the 2nd 28th Battalion, his headquarters was hit with a fierce Japanese attack. Although Galash did not know it at the time, the whole 79th Regiment had infiltrated his battalion's position. A symptom of the very long front and meagre Australian resources, the 2nd 3rd Pioneers had arranged their companies over a very large area. The 4 companies were dispersed over 3,000 metres, each holding its own high ground position and arranged for 360-degree defence. Between these hilltop fortifications, the Japanese could use the cover of the jungle to manoeuvre large elements undetected. And despite the orders to do so, the Pioneers were not able to effectively use patrols to prevent this enemy infiltration. In fact, most of Colonel Kaneki Hayashida's fresh 79th Regiment had moved through their positions and was now assembled less than 2 kilometres from Kokoda and Scarlet Beach. Apart from his companies of the 1st Battalion, which were detached for the diversion to the north, Hayashida had the whole of his relatively fresh regiment, as well as part of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Artillery Regiment. Hayashida divided his forces, with the Song attacking force consisting of Major Takehama's 2nd Battalion, and the Katika attacking force consisting of Major Uchida's 3rd Battalion. Hayashida's plan was to exploit the gap in the Australian positions in the Katika-Song area. The Song force's objective was to maintain the gap so it could be exploited by the Katika force, which would advance to the mouth of the Song River, swing south, and roll up the Australian positions from the rear. By 7 AM on the 17th, the first element of Hayashida's plan had already been achieved. The entire regiment had penetrated the 2nd 3rd Pioneers' defences and was in position to attack the beachhead. Before any of them even knew it, the Pioneers were surrounded and outnumbered by a force 3 times their size. Each of the 4 Australian companies were holding good defensive positions, with 3 further inland, and the battalion headquarters, with a support company, holding the rearmost position. Although all 4 companies were hit with fearsome attacks, the Japanese focused their attention on the battalion HQ. At dawn, Sergeant Glasgow led a section-strength patrol from the battalion HQ position. Within minutes, it had clashed with several Japanese elements, and it was clear that they were forming up for an attack. The battle began in earnest at 11 AM. Behind a heavy mortar barrage, the Japanese attacked in a force that was over a company in strength. But the terrain favoured the defender. As the Japanese men struggled to clamber up the steep slope, grenade fire began to take a heavy toll. One section, under the command of Warrant Officer Kirby, watched a Japanese element climb up towards him. When they were just 10 metres away, the section simply rolled grenades down the hill, killing 3 and wounding several more. After an hour of continuous battle, the attack was repulsed with heavy loss, and with the combat abating, Kirby led a patrol out to harass the enemy. This force made contact with the Japanese element and withdrew after a confused firefight. Another fierce attack developed at 7:20 PM. This was again beaten back, but the Pioneers in the forward elements were now very short of ammunition. They had suffered 9 casualties with 3 killed in action. Their headquarters company position rested on a pair of hills, with one higher ground position slightly exposed and a few hundred metres away from the main line. This was held by a single platoon. The fighting on this high ground position had been fierce, but the men had held it all day. This detachment was getting short of ammunition, and one of the men had his rifle destroyed by a bullet. He was sent down to the main company position to get a new rifle and some additional ammunition. Whilst he was waiting for the ammunition to be issued, he turned around to see the rest of the platoon marching down off the hill. Despite the fact that there was ample ammunition at the main position, and the trooper was about to return with as much as he could carry, the other men had decided to withdraw since they were low on rifle rounds. This was a critical mistake. The position was absolutely defensible, and the platoon was still in good strength. Ammunition was not a critical problem, as there was ample at the main defensive position. Resupply would have been facilitated within the hour. The Australian official history does not record the name of the officer who ordered this withdrawal, probably in an attempt to protect the man from disgrace, but it was an extremely poor decision. The Japanese immediately noticed the movement, and within minutes, cheers were emanating from the platoon's former position. With Japanese elements now holding high ground dominating his defences, Galash decided to withdraw and reinforce the 2nd 28th Battalion at Scarlet Beach. The Pioneers had held up the 79th Regiment for a day, buying Brigadier Evans critical time to reorient his forces, but with the abandonment of Galash's HQ position, the door to Scarlet Beach was now wide open. As Galash had lost telephone contact with his 3 forward companies early in the day, the rest of the battalion were unaware of his withdrawal. Despite their isolation and intense Japanese attacks, these men simply held their positions. The company HQ reached the 2nd 28th by 9 PM, where it would act as a battalion reserve. By nightfall on the 17th, the Australian position at Finschhafen was becoming critical. The line had effectively been broken around Kokoda, and the 79th Regiment was within 3,000 metres of the beach defences. Scarlet Beach itself was only held by a reinforced infantry battalion. If it fell, the division's artillery positions would soon follow. Back at Dobadura, General Morshead had read General Katagiri's captured order. As Wootton faced crisis and defeat at Finschhafen, fully a third of the 9th Division, the 26th Brigade, was sitting idle at Lae. New Guinea Force simply lacked the transportation to move it forward. Without waiting for a request from Wootton, Morshead sent the following message to MacArthur. Strong enemy attack developing Finschhafen. Desire move 26th Australian Infantry Brigade and 1 field ambulance from Lae to Finschhafen earliest possible. Require 14 LCIs to load personnel G Beach. Require also 6 LSTs load Buna ammunition and supplies urgently needed Finschhafen. This time, there was no nonsense from MacArthur's headquarters. MacArthur himself was reading the situation reports from Finschhafen and was becoming increasingly concerned by what he was hearing. It had taken near defeat to do it, but GHQ was beginning to question its own intelligence assumptions. Even before MacArthur gave the order authorising its use, General Berryman informed Morshead that Task Force 76 would provide the 14 LCIs and 6 LSTs. It would depart Buna for Lae at 2:30 p.m. on the 18th to transport the 26th Brigade to Finschhafen. In his order to Admiral Carpenter and Generals Kenny and Mackay, MacArthur stated that, at the earliest practicable date the reinforcement would take place, the Navy would transport and protect, and the Air Force would support irrespective of present commitments. Finally, the gravity of the situation at Finschhafen was now evident to all. Back at Scarlet Beach, Brigadier Evans was questioning his dispositions. He had been ordered by General Wootton to hold critical ground to the north of the Song in order to allow for future offensive operations. However, this meant his right wing was extended and exposed. The 2nd 43rd Battalion was holding positions as far north as Bonga, some 4 kilometres from the mouth of the Song. Evans did not want to abandon this ground that had been so hard won, but by shortening his line, additional forces would be available to defend the thinly held Katika area. Thus, the 2nd 43rd Battalion was ordered to abandon its right flank positions and move back to the beachhead. The 2 companies made the 8-kilometre march in darkness, through sodden, muddy tracks. They arrived, exhausted, just before first light. Although it had lost ground to the north, the critical Scarlet Beach sector was now much more firmly held. Including headquarters elements, there were now 6 companies of the 2nd 28th, 2nd 43rd and 2nd 3rd Pioneers arranged in a semicircle, forming a compact defensive line. As the night of the 17th had been relatively quiet, Wootton decided to regain the initiative. At 8:15 am on the 18th, his operation order stated that 9th Australian Division will resume the offensive immediately. The 24th Brigade would regain effective control of area held by it on 16 October, and any post vacated will be re-established in strength. This was to be achieved by an immediate counterattack executed by the 2nd 28th Battalion, which was ordered to advance and re-establish contact with the pioneer companies that were still cut off. As the Australians were assembling, they were hit by a fierce attack, and this soon put an end to any hopes of advance. The Japanese smashed the forward positions at Katika, but were stopped by tenacious and determined resistance. Worryingly, elements of Japanese infantry were beginning to infiltrate into the rear of the division. A group of 20 had crossed the Siki Creek and attacked the artillery positions to the south. They were only driven off by the 40mm fire of a Bofors crew. It was clear that the 79th Regiment was shifting the focus of its attack to the right at Katika. The 2nd 28th faced several attacks that day. During the battle as a whole, the bravery and commitment of the Japanese in attack was only equalled by the stubbornness and tenacity of the Australians in defence, but by the end of the 18th of October, the Japanese were finding gaps between the Australian units. Artillery, anti-aircraft positions and dressing stations were all attacked during the day. Eager to close these gaps, Brigadier Evans decided upon more drastic action. Despite the ferocity of battle there, 2 companies of the 2nd 28th were holding Katika with relative ease. However, Evans decided that if he pulled them closer to Scarlet Beach, his line would be so compact that no more gaps would remain. Indeed, with such a concentration at the beachhead, 8 companies in all, he was confident he could hold it no matter what the Japanese threw at him. This may have made sense, but not only was Kokoda an excellent defensive position, it was the junction between the 20th and 24th Brigades. At 11 PM on the 18th, Japanese forces finally found Kokoda evacuated, and Japanese patrols reached the sea to the south of Scarlet Beach. By abandoning Kokoda to the enemy, Evans was allowing Hayashida to drive a wedge between Wooten's various forces. The 9th Division had been cut in half. This was a critical positional deficit. "They are screwing the scrum," Wooten told Windeyer. Thinking the Australian forces were in full retreat towards Finschhafen in the south, as opposed to Scarlet Beach in the north, the capture of Kokoda seemed to be Hayashida's moment of victory. Once it was in Japanese hands, he issued the following orders. The night attack on the Kokoda position was successful with great fighting of the frontline units, who captured it at 2000 hours. 2. 79th Infantry Regiment will mop up the Song and Ardent Point areas as already planned. A portion will secure firmly Ardent Point and Kokoda against the enemies in the direction of Heldsbach. The main strength will be concentrated 1 kilometre northwest and make preparations for future attacks. This was exactly what Wooten feared. If the Japanese were free to swing south, he would lose his artillery, and the 20th Brigade's battalions would be wedged between the 80th and 79th Regiments. Although he had not directly overruled Evans, Wooten immediately redeployed his meagre reserves. All he had was 2 companies of the depleted 2nd 13th Battalion, which had borne the brunt of the fighting to take Finschhafen. But in the end, this was all he needed. These were deployed to take up blocking positions south of Kokoda across the Siki Creek. When the Japanese resumed the advance south on the 19th, they expected to conduct mopping up operations, exploiting a victory that had already been achieved. But when they advanced across the Siki Creek, they ran into a brick wall. Finding the Australian defence here just as stubborn as Kokoda had been, the Japanese withdrew to regroup. Rather than conducting mopping up operations around the Song, the Japanese were now facing a 24th Brigade that was in a better defensive position than it had been on the 16th. These orders clearly show that Japanese command had a very poor operational picture and understanding of Australian dispositions. Nonetheless, by the 19th of October, the 20th Japanese Division had succeeded in splitting the 9th Division into 2 groups divided by the Siki Creek. But the battle had been so intense, and the defence so stubborn, that the Japanese, depleted and disorganised by 3 days of constant battle, could not exploit their success. The repeated attacks on various Australian positions, one after another, had each taken their toll on the attackers who, suffering very significant casualties, were now disordered, exhausted, and low on ammunition. As this dramatic battle was unfolding between the 79th Regiment and 24th Brigade, north of the Siki, on the Sattelberg Road, the 80th Regiment had been hurling itself against the 2nd 17th Battalion. Holding the same excellent defensive position at Jivivanang as Grant's company, in addition to the high ground positions on the left and right, the battalion was arranged perfectly for defence. Despite repeated attacks, the 2nd 17th did not give an inch. Frustrated by the stubbornness of the position in front of them, the Japanese infiltrated to the rear and established a pocket astride the Sattelberg Road. This made supply difficult, although this problem was rectified by the utilisation of an alternate route from the south through Easy Street. Many Japanese soldiers were depressed by their lack of success around Jivivanang. "I eat potatoes and live in a hole," wrote one infantryman, "and cannot speak in a loud voice. I live the life of a mud rat or some similar creature." "What shall I eat to live?" wrote another. "What has happened to the general attack? The enemy patrol is always wandering around day and night." Indeed, despite the dramatic events of the previous 3 days and the precarious position facing the Australians, the reality was the attack of the 20th Japanese Division was culminating. General Katagiri's battle plan had 3 major pillars, but only one had achieved a moderate level of success. The beach landing had ended in disaster, and the 80th Regiment had completely failed to make any meaningful headway around Sattelberg. Only the 79th Regiment had achieved any of its operational goals, taking Kokoda and splitting the 9th Division. But even that success was limited. The 24th Brigade was holding a very formidable defensive perimeter around Scarlet Beach, and the regiment as a whole was so badly bruised by the ferocity of the preceding battle that it could make no headway against the 2nd 13th Battalion to the south. The Japanese forward positions at places like Kokoda, Siki Cove and around Scarlet Beach were becoming harder to supply. After all, there were still intact Australian forces in the rear of the 79th Regiment. The 3 stranded pioneer companies were still holding their ground. One of these positions dominated the Kokoda track, a major ground line of communication used by the 79th Regiment, meaning resupply and reinforcement had to take a long detour through the jungle. Every Japanese company had suffered severe casualties, a direct result of the vigour and determination of their assaults. Many attacks were pressed hard in the face of withering fire and determined resistance. Facing these growing challenges, and now having completed his first operational task, Hayashida ordered the 79th Regiment to regroup and await events in other sectors. By the 20th, with the pressure largely abating, Wooten ordered Evans to repair the damage done around Kokoda and re-establish contact with the 20th Brigade. The morning opened with another Japanese attack on the 2nd 28th position south of Scarlet Beach. And despite being hard pressed, this, too, was driven off without any forfeiture of ground. In response, the Japanese pocket at Siki Cove was hammered by the division's artillery. In fact, the 25-pounders at Heldsbach had played a critical role in the battle, providing badly needed fire support to the widely dispersed companies and battalions, many of which were facing attacks by superior Japanese formations. Thinking the Japanese element had withdrawn due to casualties sustained, a number of patrols advanced south, with the objective of making contact with the 2nd 13th Battalion. As one company moved out towards the cove, they were stopped by heavy medium machine gun fire. The company, now down to a frontline strength of 42 men, could not take the Razorback Ridge which dominated the Siki crossing. Despite the failure of this attack, the machine gun positions were localized. One by one these were silenced by an accurate 3-inch mortar bombardment. The 2nd 13th were so close that they could see this attack, and late in the afternoon, a patrol eventually made contact, finally rejoining the 2 Australian brigades. 5 kilometres inland, the 3 companies of pioneers were still sitting in their defences, beating back regular Japanese attacks. One had been in intermittent communication with the 2nd 17th, and by the 20th had moved into a position covering the Japanese pocket behind Jubevenang. However, the other 2 companies had not been in contact with anyone since the 16th. They had deployed on that day with ample ammunition and 3 days' rations, but were now starting to run low on food. Lieutenant Dunn's company was still in position along the Kokoda track, usefully blocking Japanese communications. They were now on quarter rations. At 11:15 am, a boomerang dropped a message which stated, "Stragglers instructed to come in moving south to road Sattelberg to Heldsbach or direct to Scarlet Beach. Destroy weapons abandoned. Carry all possible." Dunn's men, who had held their position valiantly, alone and surrounded for 4 days, resented being called stragglers. They carried all of their weapons as they advanced towards friendly positions and killed 4 enemies as they moved. Siegmund's company had also manned their positions resolutely. Dead Japanese were piling up in front of their fighting positions, so much so that the smell was starting to affect the men. At dawn on the 20th, the company was subjected to Australian artillery fire. In response, they made a large signal of white sheets which said AIF SOS. Seeing this message, another boomerang dropped the same orders as Dunn received. Siegmund's men were even more incensed at being called stragglers, so much so that they decided to stay put. Another sign was displayed saying C-140, the company's serial number, here and awaiting orders. For the proud men of the 2nd 3rd Pioneers, they would rather sleep in their fighting positions without food than consider themselves stragglers. The next morning, the men received another message, one they deemed more appropriate, ordering the company to move to Scarlet Beach. The force, 80 men strong with 1 3-inch mortar and 2 Vickers guns, besides the usual weapons of 2 infantry platoons, then buried the surplus ammunition and marched out to the north in single file after a meal of hot stew and with only 1 tin of bully beef a man left. By 3 p.m. they had reached the Song River, and, after being fired upon by the 2nd 43rd's mortars, Siegmund reported to brigade headquarters. The experience of these pioneer companies had exemplified a lesson Wooten had been trying to instill in his infantry battalions. Unlike North Africa, in jungle warfare against the Japanese, when your position had been bypassed, holding your ground, rather than withdrawal, was often the correct course of action. After all, although he was in your rear, you were now in his, and by maintaining these positions, the pioneers had greatly confused and complicated the Japanese operational picture. 15 kilometers to the south, 16 large amphibious vessels entered Dregger Harbour. This was Task Force 76. On board was the headquarters of Brigadier Whitehead's 26th Brigade, 3 infantry battalions, the 2nd 48th, 2nd 24th and 2nd 23rd, and C Squadron of the 1st Tank Battalion. The LSTs carried 18 Matilda II tanks and a number of support vehicles. The Finschhafen area had been inspected by the 1st Tank Battalion back on the 9th of October, where it had been decided that armour could have effectively been utilised to deal with the Japanese bunker defences. Nonetheless, no preparations were made to deploy any armoured elements in support of the 9th Division. The squadron was literally given 6 hours notice to move, and was on the water within that time frame. The Matilda was a first-generation infantry tank. It was slow, but heavily armoured by 1940 standards. In the European theatre of operations, the Matilda had been rendered obsolete by weapons such as the 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun, or even the 50mm PaK-38, which could both penetrate its 3-inch thick frontal armour from a range of 500 metres. But the threat environment in the Pacific was very different. In the jungle, the Japanese formations rarely deployed large-calibre, high-velocity anti-tank guns, and the Matilda went on to have a very successful late-war career with the Australian Army. As the day of the 20th passed, it was clear that the Japanese counterattack had been fought to a standstill. The tenacity and dogged defence displayed by the 9th Division at Tobruk was again on show at Finschhafen. But now, with his division intact and the 3rd Brigade deployed, Wooten could go back over to the offensive. Furthermore, that night, the Japanese were heard digging in all around the Australian line. Wooten decided to reorganise his forces, some of which had become badly disordered by the Japanese attack. The centre of his line, from Katika to Jivevedang, was an area currently held by the 2nd 13th Battalion, which would be relieved by the 2 battalions of the 26th Brigade, the 2nd 23rd being designated as the Division Reserve. The 2nd 13th would attack up the Sattelberg Road with the objective of clearing the pocket behind the 2nd 17th. Although it took 24 hours to move up the new battalions, by last light on the 21st, it was clear that the tide had decisively turned in the Australians' favour. The Japanese had suffered heavily. The 24th Brigade alone estimated it had killed 500 enemy soldiers. Around the 2nd 28th Battalion's fighting positions, which bore the brunt of the 79th Regiment's attack, there were quite literally piles of enemy dead. On the 21st, observation posts detected significant enemy movement around the 24th Brigade's perimeter, especially around Katika. These seemed to indicate a large-scale withdrawal. Keen to give his position greater depth, Evans immediately ordered several patrols out to ascertain the enemy positions. They had finally evacuated Siki Cove, and by midday, Evans ordered the 2nd 28th to advance about 500 metres inland and establish a new defensive position. Coppock and Head's companies had just finished entrenching when, at dusk, a ferocious Japanese attack came screaming down the main track. The infantry, who charged behind the typical bugle call, were covered by machine guns which had been placed 150 metres forward of the Australian positions. The 2nd 28th Battalion again went about their well-honed craft, tearing into the advancing infantry with cool and steady rifle fire, inflicting heavy casualties. The main effort fell on Lieutenant Rook's platoon, which occupied positions right on the main track. In front of his platoon's foxholes, Rook personally counted 47 dead Japanese men, with signs that others had been dragged back into the jungle. The movement of the 2nd 28th to new positions had effectively acted as a spoiling attack. Hayashida had ordered the 2nd Battalion to attack the beachhead again on the night of the 22nd. However, the Australian advance had taken their forming up point. With the battle clearly turning against him, General Katagiri's orders were now becoming far less aggressive. He was beginning to look to defence. 1. The enemy is gradually increasing his strength in Ardent Point area. The enemy has increased his strength in River Song area. They have their eyes set towards Warreo. A portion of the enemy in Kumawa area is advancing towards Sisi Sattelberg Heights. The 79th Regiment will attack the enemy in the east of Katika at daybreak of the 23rd and secure the line firmly. From 1000 hours, execute an attack on the enemy, which is the 2nd 32nd Battalion, constructing the position. Direct the main strength to the right flank and attack. Other units will continue their present duty. 2 companies of the fresh 2nd 32nd Battalion had arrived on the top of an excellent defensive feature just east of Katika when the Japanese, following Katagiri's orders, appeared hoping to occupy it. In something of a meeting engagement, the Australians again had the advantage of terrain and the enemy were beaten back with heavy losses. The Japanese were undeniably brave, but these line infantry divisions lacked the tactical prowess of the elite formations the Allies engaged in the battles of 1942. Unlike encounters with the South Seas Detachment, at Finschhafen, Japanese attacks were often repetitive and tactically unimaginative. They would attack over and over again, often from the same direction into the teeth of the same defences they had just failed to overcome. This occurred at Kokoda. The Japanese attacked the 2nd 32nd along the track 3 times that day, and every time they were cut down in the same place. Wellington's infamous description of Waterloo was surely a good summation of these actions. They came on in the same old way, and we sent them back in the same old way. On the 23rd, General Morshead visited the Finschhafen front to confer with Wootton. The men of the 9th Division were glad to see their old commander again. Many came out to meet him as he toured the battalions. This was, as fate would have it, the anniversary of El Alamein, and again the 9th Division had seemingly won a significant victory. Later that day, the two generals went to Brigadier Evans' headquarters, where the 3 men discussed the battle at Scarlet Beach. Evans defended his actions vigorously, stating that the abandonment of Kokoda was a tactical necessity. Indeed, not only was he the man on the ground at the time, but he had won the battle, and his brigade had borne the brunt of the 79th Regiment's attack. Nonetheless, both Wootton and Morshead believed he had needlessly sacrificed vital ground. His position, they maintained, should have been composed of a number of defended localities sited on important ground, rather than a continuous line, accepting that enemy penetrations were a part of jungle warfare. Whether Evans had acted properly or not, Wootton announced a desire to relieve him of command, to which Morshead agreed. After all, he had not confirmed to Wootton's orders, and it was his prerogative to lead the team he thought was best. The men of the 24th Brigade were sad to say goodbye to their brigadier. His career was not over, however. Blamey appointed him commander of the Beenleigh Tactical School, which he ably led until the end of the war. In any case, this phase of the battle was certainly over. In a letter to General Blamey, General Mackay outlined the situation as he saw it. For the time being at least, the Nips have almost wrested the initiative from the 9th Division. Had the 24th Brigade followed 20th Brigade immediately to Finschhafen, I agree with you, the result may well have been very different, and Sattelberg could have been seized early, whereas now it will probably mean a very stiff fight to take it. With all due respect to our friends, I think this incident shows the weakness of trying to fight battles from a distance with fixed assumptions that the enemy is bent on withdrawal and that he is incapable of increasing the number of his forces. In point of fact, far from withdrawing, his intention seems to be just the opposite. As the evidence suggests, this was an accurate evaluation of the battle. The refusal of MacArthur or his staff to simply move the majority of the 9th Division to Finschhafen in the first place, as virtually all of the Australian generals had wanted, had precipitated a situation that nearly brought about catastrophe and defeat. Unwilling to compromise his plans, MacArthur simply refused to believe that there were significant Japanese forces in Finschhafen, preferring his own estimate of 3,000 to the intelligence staff at both General Headquarters and New Guinea Force. Including subsidiary units and the stragglers of the 51st Division, enemy strength in the area was closer to 15,000. He only relented when it was almost too late. Despite his obvious talent as a campaign planner, MacArthur had again displayed inflexibility and disconnection from events on the ground, traits he had shown all throughout the desperate battles of 1942. He had fallen into the trap of seeing reality as he wished it to be, rather than as the evidence showed it. Diverting resources to aid the 9th Division was a significant inconvenience, disrupting his carefully constructed campaign plan that was already moving into New Britain and the Admiralties. Accepting that the Japanese units at Finschhafen were not a minor, already beaten force was difficult for MacArthur, and the idea that the 20th Brigade was about to face the whole 20th Japanese Division was simply a bridge too far. MacArthur got lucky at Finschhafen. Or rather, he was lucky that the formation which happened to be dropped into the mess of his creation was the 9th Australian Division. By the 28th of October, the Japanese were steadily being pushed back. In the Scarlet Beach and Kokoda areas, the Australian battalions made a series of small advances with the aim of occupying dominating terrain features. The battered 79th Regiment put up only sporadic resistance. Around Sattelberg, however, the 80th Regiment was as determined as ever, and the positions around Jvevedang remained unchanged. With the advance to CO now Wooten's primary objective, Morshead ordered the 4th Brigade to be moved up to the Finschhafen area. A militia formation, this would allow the whole 9th Division to focus on the Battle of Sattelberg, which was unlikely to be any easier than the Battle of Finschhafen had been. The counterattack of the Japanese 20th Division had resulted in very heavy casualties for the attackers. 679 dead Japanese men had been counted by the Australians, but many, many more must have been killed in the fighting, fallen amongst the kunai grass and dense jungle, or killed by artillery and mortar fire. Wooten's staff made a conservative estimate of enemy casualties as 1,500. In the words of the Australian official history, the victory had been won mainly by the determination and valour of the individual units which had stubbornly held on when the fog of war was thickest and when disaster seemed imminent. As a result of this dogged resistance, the enemy was forced to pause his furious assault, thus allowing the Australians time to reorganise. When the assault resumed, it was stopped in its tracks and finally turned into a retreat. It appeared at one stage, stated General Adachi after the war, that the attack was on the verge of success, but it ended in complete failure. To the Australians, the cost of this key battle was 228 casualties, including 49 killed. The 6-week-long Battle of Finschhafen was finally over. It had been an extremely close-run affair, and from the 16th to the 19th of October, the Australian army was closer to a large-scale defeat than it had been at any time since Singapore. Even during the desperate battles of the Kokoda track campaign, the 7th Division was never really faced with annihilation. It always had a good defensive feature to fall back to, and by the time it reached Yori Biwa, Moresby itself was very strongly held. Indeed, the only other Allied division that faced such a test against the Japanese was probably the 1st Marine Division at Henderson Field, and even then, the Marines never had their position compromised in the same manner as the Australians at Finschhafen. The Allies were lucky that it was the 9th Australian Division that had been selected for this operation. Fighting in such an exposed forward position, their formation penetrated and forward elements cut off and surrounded by the ferocious attack of the 79th Regiment, denied meaningful air support and provided with very limited reinforcement, many inferior formations would have panicked. It was only the cool and calm leadership of the battalion commanders and the sheer stubbornness of the infantry that prevented utter disaster. All throughout the battle, Australian elements, often as small as companies, were cut off by enemy penetrations. But rather than alarm and retreat, the Australians simply stood their ground, and the combination of cool and disciplined rifle fire, the excellent placement of automatic weapons, and equally excellent fire support from the battalion's mortars and the division's artillery took an extremely heavy toll on the Japanese. Indeed, the soldiers and officers of the 20th Japanese Division were flummoxed by the sheer tenacity and stubbornness of the defence. No matter what they did, they simply could not get the Australians to retreat from vital ground. Only at Katika and the headquarters of the 2nd 3rd Pioneers did the division give up important positions, and in both cases, rather than exhaling sighs of relief, the men complained. Furthermore, the very limited withdrawal executed by Brigadier Evans, a minor tactical movement designed to shorten his line, a manoeuvre which may have actually been warranted at the time, led to his replacement, clear evidence of the command culture within the division. Another point which needs to be emphasised is how little fire support the 9th Division received at Finschhafen. Very early in the campaign, General Kenny was ordered to divert almost all of his resources away from the Huon Peninsula. The overwhelming Allied advantage in the air was simply absent from the battle. In fact, in terms of heavy and medium bombers, the Japanese actually dropped more bombs than the Allies. Only the boomerangs of No. 4 Squadron played a significant role in the battle, providing close air support, reconnaissance, and, at times, communication with isolated elements. This contrasts sharply with the massive use of air power in other major battles throughout the Pacific Campaign. When facing very heavily entrenched Japanese forces in places like the City and Triangle, the 20th Brigade had to face the all-too-familiar Japanese bunker complex without armoured support. Again, the tanks were available, but they were not brought forward. But through the high fighting spirit of the infantry and the tactical competence of the battalion and brigade commanders, these formidable fortifications were outflanked and outmanoeuvred, compelling the Japanese to abandon Finschhafen with most of their forces still intact. At no point in the battle did the 9th Division enjoy a force ratio advantage. In fact, it was outnumbered the moment it landed on Scarlet Beach. But what really decided the battle was the courage, tenacity, and calmness of just a few Australian battalions. During the critical moment, when the Japanese seemed to be everywhere and the noise of battle was behind them, these companies and battalions simply stood and fought, and in doing so, soaked up the impetus of the 20th Division's counterattack. Because the Australian line was so thinly held, and there was no operational depth to the 9th Division's position, meaning there was basically nowhere to retreat to, had these formations wilted, then the battle would have almost surely been lost. But the 2nd 17th, 2nd 43rd, and especially the valiant 2nd 28th battalions all kept their heads, held their positions, and fought the Japanese to a standstill. The 2nd 28th specifically had slaughtered the 79th Regiment around Kokoda. There were quite literally piles of dead Japanese soldiers who had bravely charged the Australian gun line, wave after wave, falling right on top of their comrades. In essence, during the 3 days after the 16th of October, these 3 battalions essentially faced down the entire 20th Japanese Division, and in their heroic defence had imposed such attrition on the Japanese that they could not exploit the success they had achieved by splitting the 20th and 24th Brigades. Much of this tenacity has to be explained by the quality of the 9th Division's officer corps, from captains to brigadiers. In order to fight a defensive battle well, the main trait required of an officer is a steady hand. The ability to calmly evaluate the situation and resist the inevitable doubt and anxiety caused by the fog of war, or indeed, the immense confusion of a large-scale Japanese attack in jungle conditions. Even when surrounded, the battalion and company commanders simply refused to panic, and the confidence in their defences and their men was almost universally justified, as essentially none were directly driven back by an enemy attack. Only 2 times in the entire battle did an Australian officer make a questionable withdrawal: a platoon commander at the headquarters of the 2nd 3rd Pioneers, and the abandonment of Kokoda by Brigadier Evans. In the second case, it is actually quite debatable that this was a mistake. The withdrawal of the 2nd 28th Battalion from its positions at Kokoda did allow the 79th Regiment to penetrate to the ocean at Siki Cove, which Wooten clearly viewed as a poor decision. But that evaluation of Evans' actions is actually debatable. By shortening his line, Evans had made the defensive Scarlet Beach, the 9th Division's critical position, essentially assured, and the rapid movement of the 2nd 13th Battalion to good defensive positions south of the Siki Creek made Japanese exploitation extremely difficult. Perhaps, with the crystalline view of hindsight, abandoning Kokoda was, in the end, unwarranted, but Brigadier Evans did not have such a comfortable view. In that moment, with the Japanese everywhere, shortening his line may have been a prudent decision. If we do, in fact, conclude that it was a mistake, then it was certainly an understandable one. Rather than the full-scale retreat Colonel Hayashida expected and clearly thought was ongoing, the Australians were simply reorienting their line. When the 79th Regiment moved to exploit the victory Hayashida thought he had won, they simply ran into yet more dogged resistance. The quality of the Australian officer corps at Finschhafen was no accident. The 9th Australian Division was one of the most experienced formations in the Western Alliance. Veterans of Tobruk and El Alamein, crisis was certainly no stranger to these men. The division was held in such high regard by the British Army that, on the eve of the invasion of Normandy, Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Major General Freddie de Guingand, is reported to have said, "My God, I wish we had the 9th Australian Division with us this morning." Although he probably did not fully appreciate it, MacArthur was lucky to have it on the Huon Peninsula. The Japanese had fought well, but several significant tactical and operational weaknesses had proven to be fatal shortcomings. At the operational level of warfare, General Katagiri's plan for the attack on the 16th was basically sound. The fundamental concept of using the 80th Regiment to pin and envelop the 2nd 17th Battalion on the Sattelberg Road, whilst the 79th Regiment attacked in the north, exploiting a gap in the thinly held Australian line to threaten the beachhead and rear of the 9th Division, was a good operational plan. In fact, it had nearly worked, and had the 20th Division been facing a less capable foe, victory may well have been achieved. The daring attack by the Sugino detachment had been imaginative and bold, but foolhardy. Warned of the incoming attack, the defenders were ready. But even without the capture of Katagiri's orders, Sugino was not going to land in the undefended rear of the Australian position. The beach was heavily fortified, with numerous heavy weapons, such as anti-aircraft guns and machine guns, and on the 16th of October, Scarlet Beach was firmly held by the 2nd 28th Battalion. Thus, Sugino's company was going to land right on top of an infantry battalion. Still, given the fact that this was probably Adachi's last chance to wrestle the initiative away from the Allies, it was probably worth the risk. The 79th Regiment's ability to infiltrate the widely held positions of the 2nd 3rd Pioneers allowed them to unleash a ferocious attack on the beachhead, putting severe pressure on the 9th Division's centre of gravity. This attack was so serious that it compelled Brigadier Evans to abandon Katika. Although this was the only significant withdrawal made by an Australian unit, ignoring the far less important movement of the 2nd 43rd Battalion, it did allow the Japanese to split the 9th Division and reach the ocean. Operationally, it was a very well executed attack, utilising the jungle and manoeuvre to achieve a significant force ratio advantage at one critical point. Again, had the Japanese been facing a far less competent and experienced Allied unit, this attack may well have precipitated a collapse. But poor Japanese operational security had badly compromised Katagiri's attack before it had even begun. By allowing junior officers to move into the battle area with detailed operational orders, the Japanese had given Wooten and his men a crystalline picture of their intentions. Japanese diaries and captured men were also proving to be a treasure trove of information, giving Allied intelligence a window into the morale, physical state, and disposition of the 18th Japanese Army writ large. The Japanese soldier was undeniably brave. Indeed, he was perhaps the bravest warrior in the world. This allowed for a ferocity in attack that was often unmatched, and the pressure these assaults placed on infantry defences could often be extremely severe. But Japanese officers and infantry doctrine more generally leaned too heavily on the bravery of their fighting men. With a good mix of automatic weapons and a competently constructed series of defences, these suicidal Japanese charges, often announced by a bugle call and loud battle cry, could be effectively met by a withering rain of automatic fire. All too often, the cool and steady Australians simply mowed the Japanese down as they made their screaming charge. When one of these attacks was bloodily repulsed, the Japanese would often simply form up again in the same place and re-attack in exactly the same manner. The results were not different the second, or third, or fourth time. The Australians simply gunned them down again and again. Thus, at the tactical level of warfare, when attacking, the Japanese lacked flexibility, adaptability, and finesse. When an attack failed, rather than feeling for the flanks, probing for weaknesses, or launching a diversion, they would simply charge again. Although the individual Japanese soldier was brave enough to execute these orders, it was clear that Japanese officers were relying upon said bravery to balance a lack of basic tactical competence. In essence, by bashing their head against a brick wall in this manner, they were doing nothing more than giving themselves a bloody nose. As October turned into November, it was clear that the Battle of Finschhafen had been won, but the 9th Division still had months of brutal fighting ahead of it. The ultimate Allied objective was the entire Huon Peninsula and Madang, one of the two major Japanese base areas in New Guinea. Wooten had been ordered to take Sio on the north coast, and the 20th Japanese Division was standing in his way. Although battered, General Katagiri's forces were still formidable, and in possession of excellent defensive terrain. Before any move on Sio could be contemplated, Sattelberg had to be captured. But at least he now had a full division in the field, and with the 4th Brigade en route, the 9th Division could focus entirely on routing the Japanese out of their mountain strongholds. 250 kilometres to the west, the 7th Australian Division was about to enter the mountains south of Madang. Here, some of the toughest fighting of the Pacific War awaited them. The fresh 78th Infantry Regiment was heavily entrenched on a 5,000-foot high Razorback Mountain named Shaggy Ridge. Here, as in many places throughout New Guinea, the mountains would be as much an enemy as the Japanese. As 1943 became 1944, and the Allies closed in on Madang, the mighty 18th Japanese Army would be decisively defeated, and the Pacific War would move beyond New Guinea to the Western Pacific and the Philippines.